Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into the swinging, sweat-damp, rope-strung question that's kept armchair sailors and actual insomniacs wondering for years. How did a pirate crew, 60, 80, sometimes well over 100 men, packed into a hull built for a third that number, actually stay in their beds when the sea decided to stand the ship on its ear? We're talking about a piece of rope and canvas engineering worth roughly 4 shillings in 1717. A nor'easter that killed somewhere around 144 people in a single April night off the coast of Massachusetts, and a sleeping arrangement so quietly brilliant the Royal Navy eventually made it mandatory by regulation. Welcome aboard. Tonight we're going below decks, into the dark, swinging gently while the world outside tries, in every way it knows how, to kill everyone on it. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe let a fan hum low in the corner, the kind of steady, salt-flavoured white noise that could, if you let your ears drift, pass for wind droning through rigging 200 miles from the nearest land. You're warm right now. You're dry right now. Nothing under you is moving. That won't be true where we're going. So get comfortable. Let your shoulders go loose and heavy, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The smell hits you before your eyes adjust. That's the first thing nobody warns you about. Tar, bilge water, unwashed wool, and something underneath all of it that you'll later learn is just the ship itself. Old wood that has been wet and dried and wet again for a decade, souring slowly from the inside like bread left too long in a damp cupboard. You're standing in the belly of a sloop somewhere in the Caribbean, sometime in the 1710s or 1720s, and you have just made, or been forced into, the decision that will define the rest of your life. Maybe you signed the ship's articles willingly, one more idle sailor looking for a bigger share than any merchant captain ever offered. Maybe you didn't have much choice at all. Plenty of skilled hands, carpenters and surgeons and navigators especially, were pressed straight off captured vessels because a pirate crew needed their trade more than it needed their consent. Either way, you're here now, and here is a headroom of about 5 feet, maybe 5.5 if the ship was built generously, which means you will spend the next several months of your life slightly hunched. Here's the thing about sleeping arrangements on a ship this size. There isn't room for beds. Not proper ones, not the kind with 4 legs and a frame that sits still while the world moves around it. Instead, a man near the aft ladder tosses you a tight canvas roll, about 6 feet long, with a length of rope threaded through grommets at each end. This is your bed for as long as you're aboard. It is called a hammock, and if you've never used one, you're about to have a very confusing first hour. The man who tosses it to you is Abel Rourke, the ship's sailmaker, a wiry Bristol man missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident with a marlinspike years before you ever met him, who mends canvas the way other men might tend a garden, patiently and without much conversation. Abel doesn't introduce himself so much as grunt a name and point at the beams overhead. Sling it loose, he tells you, and sling it low. You'll come to understand exactly why later. For now you just nod, because arguing with the only man on this ship who knows how to keep you from breaking your neck seems like a poor use of your first evening. You loop the rope ends over 2 iron hooks bolted into the deck beams above, roughly the width of your body plus a bit apart, and climb in the way Abel shows you, sideways, weight low, one hand on the beam for balance, because a hammock has strong opinions about being mounted like a horse and none of them are good opinions. You flip. Not spectacularly, not the first time, but enough that you land half in and half out with your feet somewhere near your own ears, and Abel doesn't laugh, exactly. But something in his face suggests he's had a very long career of watching this exact thing happen to new hands. By your 3rd night aboard, you've mostly got it. Sling low, climb sideways, lie on the diagonal rather than dead straight down the centre line, because a diagonal line across a swinging piece of canvas turns out to be the flattest, most stable position the human body can find on a moving ship. Nobody explains the physics to you in those terms, of course. Nobody on this ship has heard the word physics used that way. But every hand aboard has learned, mostly through bruises, that a fixed bunk fights the ship's roll, throws you against the rail every time the hull heels over, while a hammock simply hangs from its own centre of gravity and lets the ship roll around it. The bed doesn't fight the sea, it just refuses to argue. Congratulations, you've just been issued the single most quietly ingenious piece of equipment on the entire vessel, and you didn't even have to steal it. Space, though, is the problem nobody solves. Royal Navy regulations, decades later, would formally allot each hammock about 14 inches of width, a number so tight that sailors joked they slept spoon fashion. Each man's shoulder tucked near the next man's head, an entire deck's worth of humanity swaying together in the dark like a field of hanging cocoons. A pirate sloop crewed at 2 or 3 times the density of an honest merchant vessel, because a bigger crew meant more hands to fight and more hands to vote, had no such regulation and no such luxury. Watches were staggered in part because there simply wasn't room to hang every man's hammock at once. While half the crew stood watch topside, the other half took the beams below, and when the bell rang and the watch changed, the ropes and canvas changed hands too, still warm from the last man's sleep. It's the pirate ship's version of shift work in a call centre that never closes, except the call centre is on fire roughly once a month and nobody gets dental. Abel shows you the trick to the knot, a simple clove hitch around the hook, easy to release fast if the deck beams above you suddenly need clearing, which on a fighting ship happens more often than you'd like. He doesn't say much while he does it. You notice, over those first few nights, that his ruined hand moves faster with rope than most men's whole hands do, muscle memory doing the work that 2 missing fingers can't. Weeks pass. This part, at least, is almost pleasant, trade winds holding steady, the ship rolling in a long, lazy rhythm that after the first week stops feeling like danger and starts feeling almost like a lullaby. The whole crew swaying in unison, a below decks full of grown men rocked to sleep like infants none of them would ever admit to being. You start to understand why sailors, on returning to land after long voyages, sometimes complained that solid ground felt wrong under them, too still, too quiet, missing the gentle motion their bodies had learned to expect. The sea, it turns out, is an excellent white noise machine, right up until it isn't. Mornings settle into their own small comforts. Too, the cook, a heavy-set man everyone calls Duff, for reasons nobody bothers explaining to you, ladles out a ration that by ship's articles you're entitled to same as any officer: salted meat. Hard biscuit riddled with the occasional weevil you learn to tap out before eating, and a portion of rum or small beer depending on what's left in the hold. It isn't good food. It is, by the standards of the merchant service most of these men left behind, remarkably fair food, doled out without an officer's table getting the better cuts while the crew ate scraps. Small mercies, but on a ship where mercy is otherwise in short supply, you take them where you find them. News on a ship this size doesn't arrive through any official channel. It arrives the way gossip always has, mouth to ear, and one evening it arrives through Rafe Kinnaird, a topman who spends most of his working life 80 feet above your head, and therefore sees things long before the rest of the crew does. Rafe comes down the shrouds 2 rungs at a time, and tells the men nearest the mainmast that he's spotted a sail on the northern horizon, low and wallowing, rigging cut away at odd angles. By the time the story has travelled from the mainmast to your hammock, 3 men later, it has grown a dismasted hull, a captain lost overboard, and a crew that had to be towed the last 6 miles into a Carolina inlet by a fishing sloop that happened along. You have no way of checking any of it. You just know that whatever happened to that ship happened somewhere north of you, recently, and that everyone repeating the story keeps glancing at the same patch of sky. The watch bell, at least, gives your days a shape you can hold on to. Every 4 hours, without fail, a single sailor strikes the ship's bell in a set pattern, 1 strike per half hour, building to 8 strikes at the end of a full watch, and the entire crew reorganises itself around that sound, the way office workers reorganise themselves around a calendar invite nobody remembers accepting. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around the clock forever, with 1 shortened dog watch worked into the afternoon specifically, so the same half of the crew isn't stuck with the miserable middle-of-the-night watch every single day. It is, in its own creaking way, the pirate version of a shift schedule, except the shift schedule occasionally involves cannon fire, and nobody's ever heard of a sick day. You ask Abel, one quiet evening between watches, about his hand. He doesn't mind the question, or if he does, he doesn't show it. A marlinspike, he tells you, the iron spike sailmakers used to pry rope strands apart when splicing, slipped during rough weather 3 years back and took 2 fingers with it before he could pull free. The ship's surgeon at the time had nothing stronger than rum to offer him, and Abel drank most of it before the man even reached for his knife. He tells you this without much drama, the way another person might describe losing an umbrella. Rope doesn't care whose hand it takes, he says, tying off a stitch. Best make friends with it anyway. It's not exactly comforting. It's also the closest thing to wisdom you've heard since you came aboard. It's around this time that someone finally lets you actually read the ship's articles, the document every man aboard signed or made his mark on before the ship ever left port, and which the crew voted into being together rather than having handed down from above. You'd heard about articles like these before you ever set foot on deck, mostly as rumour. But seeing the actual terms is different. Surviving copies of similar documents, including the articles later recorded for captains like Bartholomew Roberts and John Phillips, list startlingly specific compensation for injury, a scale that promised a wounded man real money or an equivalent number of enslaved people seized as plunder for the loss of a limb or an eye, on top of an equal-ish share of whatever the voyage brought in, regardless of whether you'd signed on as an officer or an ordinary hand. Historians still debate how faithfully every crew followed the letter of documents like these, and some of the specific figures survive only through a source with its own credibility problems, which we'll get to later. But the underlying structure, a vote for captain, a written and witnessed compact, a promise that a lost hand wouldn't simply mean a lost livelihood, was real, and it was almost unheard of anywhere else at sea in that decade. A Royal Navy sailor maimed in service could expect a pension that was, charitably, difficult to collect and rarely enough to live on. You, apparently, signed onto a ship that at least tried to do better by its own. It isn't comfort exactly, but it's something. There's a particular kind of wonder in the motion once your body stops treating it as a threat. In a moderate sea, a ship this size might roll 20 or 25 degrees to either side, enough that a coin set on a flat table below decks would slide clean off, enough that green hands spend their first week walking with one hand permanently on a wall. And yet, hanging in your rope and canvas bed, you barely register it at all. The hammock's own weight lets it find the true vertical every time, swinging gently back towards centre no matter which way the hull leans, so that the worst of the ship's violence simply passes underneath you like weather passing under a bird. You start, against your better judgment, to actually enjoy it. Motion that would bruise a man standing barely rocks a man lying down. Nobody warned you the safest place on a pirate ship in bad weather might turn out to be suspended in mid-air. There's a less romantic reason the hammock earns its keep too, and it has nothing to do with storms. Ships like this one carry rats, dozens of them, sometimes more, nesting in the hold among the water casks and biscuit sacks, and a man sleeping directly on the deck planking is sleeping at rat height, which is an experience most sailors who tried it did not care to repeat. A hammock lifts you a full arm's length off the boards, out of reach of anything running along the floor in the dark, and above most of the fleas and roaches that call the lower deck home as well. It isn't why the hammock was invented. It's simply a bonus nobody advertises, the way a modern apartment listing might quietly leave no rats off the list of amenities, because it's assumed, when on a ship in 1720, it very much was not. A hammock like yours wasn't expensive, exactly, but it wasn't free either. Ready-made canvas hammocks bought in a port town ran somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 shillings apiece in the early 1700s. Not a fortune, but not nothing either. Roughly what a labourer ashore might earn in 2 or 3 days of honest work, assuming honest work was an option you'd ever seriously considered. Most ships carried a rough surplus, enough to replace canvas that rotted or rope that frayed, and Abel mends more of both than he'd like to admit. The going joke among the older hands, the one you'll hear repeated in a dozen slightly different versions over the coming months, is that a pirate ship's most valuable cargo isn't the plunder in the hold at all. It's the several dozen strips of tarred canvas keeping several dozen grown men from cracking their skulls on the deck boards every single night. Nobody would ever put that on a wanted poster. But it's not wrong. What happens below decks on the worst nights, when the roll stops being gentle and the swinging stops being pleasant, is a different matter entirely, and we'll get there. Not yet though, for now. The weather's still fair, the rhythm still holds, and you're still the kind of green hand who thinks a 20-degree roll is impressive. Here's what you don't know yet. Hanging there in your 4th or 5th week, half asleep and grateful for a bed that doesn't dump you on the floor, somewhere below the aft companionway, next to the binnacle, hangs a sealed glass tube filled with a mixture the ship's master swears by and nobody younger than 40 has ever been taught to read properly. A weather glass, essentially a crude barometer, the kind English sailors had been carrying since the late 1600s, its liquid level rising and falling with air pressure in ways that, to a practiced eye, predicted a storm's arrival hours or even a full day before the sky gave any hint of it. The captain checks it most mornings. You've walked past it a dozen times without a second glance. That's about to change. Weather glasses like this one had been standard equipment on English ships since roughly the 1680s, descended from Evangelista Torricelli's mercury barometer of 1643, but simplified into something a working sailor could read at a glance, rather than a scientist could calibrate in a laboratory. The principle was the same either way. Falling air pressure meant a storm gathering strength somewhere out of sight, and a captain who checked his glass daily could sometimes see trouble coming a full day before the horizon offered a single hint of it. Whether your captain trusted the glass over his own weathered instincts is a question you never think to ask, mostly because you don't yet know enough to be worried. That, too, is about to change. Within a month of signing the articles, you've settled into something like a rhythm, the sailmaker's needlework above deck by day, your borrowed hammock by night, the particular sway of a ship running before steady wind. Then, one evening, you notice Abel checking the knot on your hook line twice instead of once, tugging it the way a man tugs a rope he doesn't quite trust yet. You ask him why. He doesn't answer right away. He just looks up, past the rigging, at a horizon that has gone the colour of a healing bruise, greenish, yellow at the edges, wrong in a way you can't name yet, but that every man topside has already noticed. The quartermaster passes the word not long after, moving fore to aft along the deck the way a man moves when he doesn't want to sound as concerned as he is. Master says the glass has dropped near half an inch since noon, he tells the nearest knot of sailors, and half an inch means nothing to you, a landsman's ear hearing a sailor's unit. But you watch the faces around you do the arithmetic instantly and go quiet. Half an inch, on that particular glass, on that particular sea, in that particular decade, was the kind of number old hands didn't need explained to them twice. Sling it tighter tonight, Abel says, and this time there's no humour in it at all. You don't know it yet, hanging there in the fading light, the rhythm of the last month still humming pleasantly under you, but the easy weeks are over. The glass has been falling since noon, the sky has gone the wrong colour, and somewhere out past the horizon, weather is already deciding what kind of night this is going to be. Around you, the ship changes shape without anyone announcing it. Men who were mending line or playing at dice a half-hour ago are suddenly moving with a different kind of urgency, checking lashings on the boats, glancing up at canvas that will need to come in long before the wind demands it. Abel finishes his last stitch of the evening, bites the thread, and coils his tools away with more care than usual. The way a man packs when he suspects he'll need everything exactly where he left it. Nobody has said the word storm out loud yet. Nobody needs to. You've been aboard barely 5 weeks, and even you can read it now, in the colour of the sky, in the half-inch the glass has dropped, in the tightness of Abel's knot on your hook line. Whatever calm you'd gotten used to, it's finished for tonight. You climb out of your hammock, roll it tight the way Abel taught you weeks ago, and go up the ladder to see for yourself what everyone else has already seen. The wind on your face is warm still, almost gentle, which somehow makes it worse. A storm that announces itself early is a storm that means to be taken seriously. Below you, in the space you've just left, your hammock hangs coiled and still, waiting. In a few hours, depending on how the night goes, it will either be the safest place on this entire ship or completely irrelevant to your survival. You don't know which yet, nobody does, until the wind actually arrives. That hanging bed you'd taken for granted a month into your voyage didn't invent itself, and it certainly wasn't a European idea. To understand why it was waiting for you below decks at all, you have to go back more than 2 centuries earlier, to a stretch of Caribbean coastline no European had ever laid eyes on. On the night of October 12th, 1492, according to the journal he kept of the voyage, Christopher Columbus and his men came ashore on an island in the Bahamas and encountered something none of them had a word for. The people who lived there, Tano Islanders, part of a broader Arawakan-speaking culture spread across the Caribbean, slept not on the ground and not on raised wooden frames, but in nets of woven cotton or bark fibre slung between 2 trees, swaying gently above the forest floor. The Tano called it a hamaka. Columbus and his crew, groping for a way to describe something so unfamiliar, borrowed the word almost exactly as they heard it. Within a generation, hamaka had become the Spanish hamaca, which became the English hammock, and the word has barely changed since. A linguistic fossil embedded in modern English from a culture that European colonization would go on to devastate within decades. The genius of the design wasn't really about comfort, not at first. It was about survival in a specific environment. A hammock strung between trees kept a sleeper off the jungle floor, away from ground-dwelling snakes, biting insects, and the damp that soaked into anything left lying on tropical soil overnight. Spanish sailors who encountered the hamaka almost immediately recognized something else in it too. On a rolling ship. A bed that didn't need to touch the floor, and that could absorb motion rather than fight it was worth more than any amount of carpentry could offer. Within decades of first contact, Spanish vessels crossing the Atlantic were carrying hammocks as standard sleeping gear, adapted from a Caribbean invention to solve a problem several thousand miles and an entirely different climate away from where it was born. This is the story of an object most people alive today have used maybe twice, in a backyard, on vacation, without ever once wondering where it came from. The hammock, the piece of woven cord that quietly reshaped how European navies slept at sea for the next 3.5 centuries. The English were slower to formally adopt it than the Spanish, in the way the English were often slower to adopt things that hadn't yet proven themselves financially or militarily necessary. For much of the 16th century, English sailors still largely slept on the bare deck, on loose straw pallets, or crammed into low wooden bunks called cabins that were really just shelves, fixed, rigid, and about as forgiving as you'd expect a shelf to be in a rolling sea. Injuries from men being thrown out of these fixed berths during rough weather were common enough to be an accepted cost of the job. The kind of thing a ship surgeon simply expected to be treating after any bad night. Nobody had yet connected the dots between the flexible Spanish sleeping nets and a straightforward reduction in broken bones. The connection got made, eventually, and it got made through exactly the kind of institution you'd expect to eventually notice that its sailors were constantly injuring themselves for a solvable reason. In 1597, the Royal Navy formally began issuing hammocks to its crews as standard equipment, a decision recorded in Admiralty administrative records of the period, following decades of informal use by sailors who'd encountered the Spanish version during voyages to warmer waters and simply started bringing their own aboard English ships without waiting for permission. Once it was official policy, it spread fast. Within a few decades, a fixed wooden berth below decks on a Royal Navy vessel was the exception rather than the rule for ordinary sailors. Replaced almost universally by rows of hanging canvas, each one just wide enough for a single man and swaying gently in whatever rhythm the sea provided that night. Here's what made the adoption stick. Beyond simple comfort, the numbers made sense to anyone counting them. A wooden berth took up permanent space whether or not anyone was using it. A hammock, taken down each morning and lashed into a tight roll, could be stowed along the ship's rails during the day, and in wartime, those stowed hammocks did double duty as makeshift armour. Packed tight enough along a quarter-deck rail to actually stop or slow a musket ball. A Royal Navy captain in the Age of Sail wasn't just issuing his men better sleep, he was issuing every single one of them a small, personal piece of cover for the next time the ship went into action. It's hard to think of many pieces of bedding, before or since, that doubled as defensive equipment. By the time the Golden Age of Piracy was in full swing, roughly the 1690s through the early 1720s, the hammock had been standard aboard merchant and naval vessels alike for well over a century. And pirate crews, it's worth remembering, weren't building their ships from scratch or inventing new maritime technology of their own. The vast majority of pirate vessels started their working lives as merchant ships, naval vessels, or slave ships, captured and repurposed by men who had, in almost every case, spent years of their prior lives as ordinary merchant or naval sailors themselves. When a pirate crew took a ship, they inherited its rigging, its guns where it had them, its stores, and yes, its hammocks. The same rope and canvas beds every man aboard had likely slept in his entire working life, whichever flag he'd sailed under before. The physical object itself was almost embarrassingly simple, which is probably part of why it worked so well for so long. A standard ship's hammock was a rectangle of canvas, roughly 6 feet by 3, gathered at each end into a bundle of small ropes called clews, which were themselves drawn together into a single loop for hanging. Some crews used woven netting instead of solid canvas, an even closer echo of the original tonneau design, better ventilated in tropical heat but rougher against bare skin. The kind of trade-off a sailor accepted without much complaint once he understood which version his own ship happened to carry. Sailors were generally expected to maintain their own hammocks, mend the canvas, replace frayed clew lines, keep the whole assembly in working order, which is precisely the kind of unglamorous constant labour that fell to men like Abel Rourke, whose entire trade existed because rope and canvas under daily strain simply wear out, storm or no storm. A sailmaker on a well-run ship wasn't just fixing sails. He was, in a very real sense, in charge of everyone's bed. The Royal Navy wasn't alone in catching on. French naval vessels adopted their own version, the hammock, following a nearly identical path from Caribbean and South American contact through gradual naval standardization over the 17th century. Each nation arriving at roughly the same solution by way of its own overseas colonies rather than by copying its rivals directly. Dutch and Portuguese ships, both with extensive Atlantic and Caribbean trade routes of their own, picked it up on similarly overlapping timelines, to the point that by the early 1700s it's difficult to find a European maritime power whose sailors weren't sleeping in some version of the same tonneau design, filtered through a century and a half of shipboard modification. Practical ideas, it turns out, don't respect national rivalries nearly as consistently as the sailors carrying them into battle against each other did. A French and an English sailor who might spend an afternoon trying to sink one another's ship would, on any given night, be sleeping in something close to an identical bed, swaying at an identical angle. For reasons neither navy had to explain twice. Royal Navy regulation eventually got quite specific about all of this, in the particular way that large institutions tend to formalise things that started out as common sense. By the mid-1700s, official allotments stood at 14 inches of hanging width per man in ordinary circumstances, though ships routinely exceeded their intended crew complement, especially in wartime, which meant the real figure experienced by most sailors was tighter still. The solution, as you'd already discovered a month into your own voyage, was staggered watches, half the crew's hammocks up at any given time, the other half stowed, so that 14 inches of allotted space could comfortably serve a ship carrying considerably more than 14 inches multiplied by its full crew count would suggest. It was an elegant fix for a problem that on paper looked unsolvable. It also meant that on the worst nights, a sailor's hammock was frequently still warm from the last man who'd slept in it, which is either a comforting thought or a deeply unsettling one, depending on how you feel about strangers. There was a mourning ritual attached to all of this too, one so ingrained in naval life that it survived, in slightly modified form, into the 20th century, long after the Age of Sail itself had given way to steam and steel. Each morning, on the order to lash up and stow, every hammock had to be taken down, rolled tight, bound with a specific number of turns of light line. 7 turns was a commonly cited standard on Royal Navy vessels, though the exact count varied by ship and era, and stowed in racks along the rail, ready to double as musket ball padding if the day turned violent. A hammock lashed sloppily or too slowly was the kind of small infraction that could earn a man a dressing down or worse, because a badly stowed hammock wasn't just untidy. It was a hammock that might come loose and become a hazard, or worse, fail the one job it had left when a sailor needed cover from incoming fire. Pirate crews, less bound by naval formality in most respects, still generally kept some version of this discipline, if only because a below decks cluttered with loose hammocks during a fight or a storm was a below decks where men tripped, tangled, and died for entirely preventable reasons. There's one use of the shipboard hammock that sits less comfortably than all the rest, and it deserves mention here rather than being politely skipped over. When a sailor died at sea, from illness, from injury, from the 100 ordinary hazards of 18th century maritime life, his own hammock very often became his shroud. The body was sewn into the canvas that had held him every night of the voyage, weighted at the feet with round shot or ballast stone to ensure it sank, and committed to the water with whatever words the ship's captain or a designated reader could offer. A widespread maritime tradition, referenced across multiple periods and navies though, with some regional variation in practice, held that the last stitch of the shroud should be passed through the corpse's nose, not out of cruelty, but as a final grim check that the man was actually dead before he went over the side, since 18th century medicine wasn't always reliable at telling a deep unconsciousness from death. It is a strange, quiet symmetry that the same rope and canvas, holding a man safely through storm after storm for months or years, would, for some of that ship's company, become the very last thing that ever held them at all. There's a quiet irony worth sitting with here. The single most effective piece of technology keeping a pirate crew's bones intact during a storm traced its lineage not to any European navy, not to any shipwright's workshop, but to an indigenous Caribbean culture that the same colonial expansion enabling transatlantic piracy in the first place had already devastated through disease and conquest by the time the Golden Age pirates were born. The Tano population of the Caribbean, estimated by various historians at anywhere from several 100,000 to over 1 million at the time of Columbus's arrival, had been reduced by disease, forced labour and violence to a small fraction of that number within a single century. And yet their word, their invention, their solution to a problem of sleeping safely in a difficult environment, survived and spread across an entire ocean, still doing exactly the job it was designed to do 200 years later, on ships crewed by men who had likely never heard the word Tano in their lives. Not every soul aboard a ship like this got a hammock either, and that fact matters more than it might first seem. The vessel at the centre of a later chapter in this story, a slave ship named the Wider Galley, built in London in 1715, specifically for the transatlantic trade, before a pirate named Samuel Bellamy captured her 2 years later, had, during her original intended service, no plan whatsoever to sling canvas beds for the roughly 300 to 400 captive Africans a ship of her size and era was designed to carry. Enslaved people transported on ships like the Wider were instead packed into shelves below decks barely high enough to sit upright in, chained, without hammocks, without the swinging cushion of motion that every free sailor on the same vessel would have taken for granted. It is one of the uglier ironies buried inside this whole story, the very same rope and canvas comfort that kept European and. Later, pirate crews from breaking bones in a storm was by design withheld from the people those ships were often built to transport. When Bellamy's crew took the Wider and refit her as a pirate vessel, they inherited a ship engineered around that absence. What her decks looked like after the refit, and what happened to the roughly 146 men aboard her on one particular night in April of 1717, is a story for later in tonight's journey. The word itself kept travelling long after the ships that carried it stopped sailing under sail at all. Hammock entered English so thoroughly that most speakers today have no idea it's a loan word at all, let alone one borrowed from a Caribbean culture, nearly wiped out within a lifetime of first contact with the people who borrowed it. Spanish retained hamaca almost unchanged. Portuguese uses reed, a slightly different word tied to the netting style rather than the Tano original. But the object it describes traces the same lineage. Dutch, French, German, nearly every European maritime language absorbed some version of either the word or the object, sometimes both, over the following 2 centuries. A piece of vocabulary and a piece of engineering, travelling together across an ocean, outliving empires, outliving the ships that carried them, outliving. In the most literal sense, most of the people who first showed a European what it was for. It's also worth being honest about what the hammock couldn't do. It could keep you from being thrown across a deck. It couldn't keep the deck dry, keep the hull from taking on water, or keep a ship from being driven onto rocks by wind stronger than any rope could compensate for. The hammock solved one specific survivable problem extraordinarily well. It had no answer at all for the much larger, much less survivable problem waiting in the next chapter of this story. A problem that, on the night of April 26, 1717, would prove that no amount of good engineering below decks can save a ship whose hull has already failed. For most nights, though, for most ordinary bad weather across 3 centuries of maritime history, the hammock did exactly what it promised. Sailors who'd used both fixed berths and hanging hammocks were near unanimous, where their opinions survive in ship's logs and later memoirs that they'd take the swinging bed every time. Comfort wasn't really the word they used. Survival was closer to it. A man could wake up bruised from a hammock that swung too hard against a bulkhead in a truly violent sea. He woke up broken, more often than not, from a fixed berth that didn't swing at all. Consider, too, just how long this particular solution stayed in active use once the Royal Navy formalised it. Sailors were still slinging hammocks in the same basic style, hooked to the same kind of overhead beam. Well into the 20th century, Royal Navy vessels carried them through both world wars, and some smaller naval and merchant ships retained hammocks over fixed bunks, well past the point where you might expect a supposedly old-fashioned technology to have been quietly retired. It wasn't sentiment keeping it around. It was the same cold arithmetic that got it adopted in the first place. Nothing else packed as many sleeping sailors into as little space, moved as safely with the ship's roll, or converted as usefully into emergency cover when trouble found the crew. An idea good enough survives fashion, survives changing empires, survives 400 years without needing much revision at all. So when you climbed into that borrowed hammock on your first night aboard, sideways, weight low, trusting a wiry sailmaker with 2 missing fingers to have rigged it correctly, you were, without knowing it, relying on roughly 200 years of accumulated trial, error, and one very old Caribbean idea that outlived the people who invented it. Somewhere on a beach in the Bahamas in October of 1492, a group of Tano Islanders showed a lost Genoese sailor something they'd already perfected. Neither side could have guessed how far it would travel, or how long it would keep men like you alive. Nor could either of them have guessed how many nights it would fail to be enough. Because a hammock, for all its engineering, can only do so much once the storm itself actually arrives. There is a strange comfort, if you're willing to look for it, in knowing the bed under you has already survived so much. Every hammock ever slung below a ship's deck belongs to an unbroken line stretching back through Nelson's Navy, through Drake's, through the first nervous Spanish sailors who couldn't quite believe a net could hold a grown man safely above a jungle floor, all the way back to a warm October night on a Bahamian beach centuries before anyone aboard your ship was born. It has outlasted the empires that adopted it, and very nearly outlasted the memory of the people who invented it. Tonight it's about to be tested the way it was always meant to be tested, against wind and water rather than curiosity, and whatever else happens before morning, the rope and canvas holding you up have already done this exact job. In some form, on some ocean, for longer than almost anything else aboard this ship. That's where we're headed next. Because somewhere above your borrowed bed, on the deck where Abel just went to see the changing sky for himself, the real preparation for a storm is only beginning, and it involves a great deal more than rope and canvas. The wind changes texture before it changes strength, and that's the first thing you notice as you come up the ladder behind Abel. It doesn't feel stronger yet. It feels wetter, carrying a mineral smell off water that a moment ago smelled like nothing at all. The particular scent sailors across centuries have described as rain still hours away, but already announcing itself. Above you, the topsails are bellied out hard, and the rigging has started to hum, a low vibrating note you'll hear again in your worst dreams for years after you leave this life, if you leave it at all. All hands on deck. The cry goes up from the quarterdeck, relayed man to man down the length of the ship, and you understand, watching 60-some men drop whatever they were doing and move with sudden, wordless coordination, that this is a drill everyone aboard has done before except you. Here's the thing about a storm at sea in the age of sail. There is no calling in sick, no waiting it out below, no option except doing your part of a job that has to be done correctly the first time, because there generally isn't a second chance to get it right once the wind arrives in earnest. The first order is one you don't understand yet. Strike the topmasts. You watch, more useful as an extra pair of hands hauling on a line than as anyone who actually understands the engineering, as the crew works to lower the upper sections of the ship's tallest masts down onto the deck, unstepping them from their sockets and lashing them horizontal rather than leaving them standing. It looks, from where you're standing, like taking a building and removing its top 2 floors in the middle of an earthquake. It is in fact exactly that kind of logic. A mast standing at full height acts like a long lever, catching wind high above the deck and multiplying every gust into a much larger force, trying to tip the entire ship over. Bring that height down, and you lower the ship's centre of effort along with it. Less top hamper, as the old hands call it, meaning less top-heavy leverage for the wind to exploit. A taller ship in a storm is a more dangerous ship. Everyone aboard already knows this the way you know not to touch a hot stove. You're just now learning why. By the time the topmasts are down and lashed, the crew has already moved on to the sails still bent to the lower yards. And this is where you finally meet Davy Prosser properly, though you'd noticed him before, a broad, quiet man in his 40s who spends most calm days below decks with an auger and a mallet, doing work you'd never thought much about. Davy is the ship's carpenter, and in weather like this, he is arguably the second most important man aboard after the captain himself, because Davy's entire job for the next several hours is going to be making sure the ship stays a ship, rather than becoming a very large, very expensive collection of firewood. Reef the topsails, and lively comes the next order, and you find yourself hauling on a line you don't fully understand, watching men far more experienced than you climb out onto swaying yards to gather in great armfuls of canvas and tie it down in smaller storm-resistant folds, reefing. The process of reducing a sail's exposed area without removing it entirely, so the ship can still be steered and controlled without catching enough wind to knock her flat. The men doing this work 80 feet above a deck that is already beginning to pitch are, by any reasonable measure, doing one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire maritime world, and they are doing it in failing light, in rising wind, for a wage that, if we're honest, no amount of pirate plunder in the world properly compensates. You watch one man's silhouette lean out over open air to grab a flogging edge of canvas, and you realise you are holding your breath without having decided to. Nobody below shouts encouragement or instruction up at him. There isn't time, and besides, he already knows exactly what he's doing up there far better than you could ever coach him through it from the deck. Davy finds you a few minutes later, between orders, and puts you to work on something closer to your actual skill level, hauling loose gear below and lashing down anything that could become a projectile once the ship starts rolling in earnest. Cannon first, he tells you, nodding toward the gun deck. And you follow him down to where the ship's guns, each one weighing anywhere from half a ton to well over a ton depending on the piece, sit on wheeled carriages that under normal conditions let gun crews haul them back for reloading. Under storm conditions, an improperly secured cannon becomes something closer to a wrecking ball with wheels, smashing loose across a pitching deck with enough force to crush a man or stave in the ship's own side. It's where the phrase loose cannon comes from, and standing there watching Davy check breaching ropes, the thick lines that hold each gun fast to the hull, you understand viscerally exactly why the phrase caught on. A loose cannon isn't a metaphor to these men, it's one of the most concrete dangers on the entire ship. By the time we're through here, Davy says, testing a knot with more force than seems strictly necessary, you'll know every rope on this ship better than your own name. He's not wrong, though you don't fully believe him yet, not until your palms are raw from 3 hours of hauling and your hands have started reaching for lines and cleats without your mind fully directing them. The way any repeated physical task eventually stops needing conscious thought at all. He works with the same unhurried thoroughness whether he's checking a breaching rope or examining the seam of a hatch cover, running a thick, calloused thumb along cork joints the way another man might check bread for freshness. Oakum, loose hemp fibre, tarred and hammered into the gaps between hull planks, is Davy's other constant concern, and in weather like this, he moves along the ship's seams checking his own earlier work with the anxious attention of a man who knows that a single failed seam, in the wrong place, at the wrong moment, can sink an entire vessel regardless of how well everyone slept the night before. Within the hour, every hatch that leads below has been covered with a tarred canvas tarpaulin and secured tight with wooden battens wedged into cleats around the hatch coaming. The raised wooden lip built specifically to give the tarpaulin something to seal against. This is the origin, if you're keeping track of such things, of the modern phrase battening down the hatches. And standing there watching Davy and 2 other men wedge the last batten into place, you understand for the first time that it was never a metaphor to begin with. It meant exactly, literally, precisely this, sealing the openings in the deck so that green water breaking over the ship couldn't simply pour straight down into the hold and drown everyone below decks before the storm even properly began. By the time the horizon has gone from bruised yellow to a flat, bruised grey, the pumps have already started their work, and they will not stop again until the storm has fully passed. Ships of this era commonly used a chain pump, an endless loop of leather and wood discs drawn up through a wooden tube, hauling bilge water out of the hold and over the side in a continuous grinding cycle that required 2, sometimes 4 men at a time, working in exhausting relay shifts. A wooden hull working in heavy seas will always take on some water. It's less a flaw than an accepted feature of a hull built from planks rather than poured from a single seamless material, and the pumps exist specifically to keep that inevitable seepage from becoming a genuine crisis. You take your turn at the pump handle within the hour, and within minutes your shoulders are burning in a way no amount of sail hauling had prepared you for. Davy, passing by with another armful of oakum, claps you once on the back. Steady rhythm, he says. Don't fight it. Just don't stop. The helm by now needs more hands than usual too. In a genuinely heavy sea, the force of water against the rudder can be strong enough that a single helmsman physically cannot hold a true course alone, and relieving tackles, extra ropes rigged to give additional men purchase on the wheel or tiller, get manned by whoever the quartermaster judges has the strength left to spare. You watch 2 men brace themselves against the wheel, muscles standing out along their forearms, fighting a ship that has started, for the first time since you came aboard, to feel genuinely unwilling to be steered. Somewhere in the middle of all this, lightning finds the horizon for the first time. A single flat flash. No thunder yet, far enough away that you can almost convince yourself it isn't headed your way. Almost, the old hands don't bother looking up at it. They've seen enough storms to know that watching lightning approach doesn't make it arrive any slower, and there's still too much work left to do to spend time on things you can't change. You, on the other hand, watch every flash like it might personally be addressed to you, which statistically, on a wooden ship carrying several tons of gunpowder in the hold, is not an entirely unreasonable fear. There's a certain dark comedy to the whole operation, if you squint. Imagine for a moment trying to explain moving apartments to someone from this deck. The idea that a person might spend an entire weekend carefully packing dishes into boxes, taping them shut, labelling which room they belong to. Here, moving day means unstepping entire masts. And the deadline isn't Sunday evening, it's however long it takes weather already visible on the horizon to arrive and try to kill you. Nobody's renting a truck. Nobody's ordering pizza for the volunteers, and nobody's getting a security deposit back if the job goes badly. The closest thing to a moving crew here is 60-odd men who signed articles promising them a fair share of whatever this ship takes, working now for no pay at all beyond the basic, non-negotiable fact of staying alive until morning. The rain arrives before the worst of the wind does, in the way it often does. First a scattering of fat, cold drops that feel almost gentle against a face already slick with sweat from hours of hauling line. And then, within minutes, a wall of it, driving nearly sideways, hard enough to sting exposed skin. Somewhere astern, the first real wave breaks over the taffrail, a slap of green water across the deck that knocks 2 men off their feet and sends a barrel that wasn't lashed quite tightly enough skidding 30 feet before it fetches up hard against the mainmast. Davy is already moving toward it before the quartermaster even finishes shouting the order, tackling the loose barrel with the flat economy of a man who has done exactly this exact job on exactly this exact kind of night more times than he'd probably care to count. It's while relashing that barrel, in fact, that the night goes wrong for him. A block. One of the wooden pulleys threaded through the ship's running rigging, heavier than it looks, swinging loose on a line that's come free somewhere aloft, catches Davy across the back of his left hand as the ship rolls hard to starboard. He doesn't cry out, exactly. He makes a low sound through his teeth and keeps working the lashing one-handed for a few seconds before anyone even notices something's wrong, which somehow makes it worse to watch rather than better. By the time Abel and another hand get to him, 2 of his fingers are already swelling dark, and the hand that spent all afternoon threading rope and testing knots with such easy confidence has gone, for now, mostly useless. "Finish the lashing," Davy says through his teeth, when Abel tries to pull him away from the barrel. Barrel first. Hand after. Abel finishes it himself in about a third the time it would have taken Davy working one-handed, and only then does he half carry Davy toward the companionway out of the worst of the rain, where the ship's surgeon, a former barber who has learned more battlefield medicine in 3 years of piracy than most physicians learn in a lifetime of peacetime practice, takes one look at the hand and starts working the swelling with a grim, practiced calm that suggests this is very far from the first crushed hand he's set. Here's the part of the night that actually matters. If you're looking for the part that matters, nobody so much as suggests that Davy's injury is his own problem to bear alone. The quartermaster, passing by minutes later on his way to check the pumps, pauses just long enough to tell Davy, flatly, that the injury will be noted in the ship's articles the same as any wound taken in a fight. A share of compensation owed for it later, whatever the crew's next prize turns out to be worth, exactly as promised on the document every man aboard signed his name, or made his mark to, before this voyage ever began. It isn't tenderness exactly, not the soft kind. It's something sturdier than that. A promise kept without being asked, in the middle of a storm, because that promise was the entire foundation this crew agreed to sail under in the first place. Davy nods, jaw tight against the pane, and goes right back to giving instructions to the men now doing his job for him, directing repairs with his good hand while his surgeon's set fingers throb under a hastily wrapped bandage. There's a moment, somewhere in the last hour of daylight, when the work slows just slightly. Everything that can be struck has been struck. Everything that can be lashed has been lashed. And the crew stands in a strange, tense quiet, waiting for whatever's coming to actually arrive. Davy finds a spare minute to tell you, without much preamble, that he'd been a shipwright's apprentice in Bristol before a bad debt, and a worse magistrate put him on a merchant vessel bound for the Caribbean, and that the merchant vessel had, in turn, been taken by a pirate crew that needed exactly his skills badly enough to make him an offer rather than a threat. Didn't choose this life, he tells you, working a fresh twist of oakum between his fingers out of pure habit rather than necessity. Chose to be good at it once I was in it. Different thing. It's the most he's said to you all day, and somehow it's also the calmest anyone has sounded since the glass started falling. The captain's voice cuts across the deck not long after, giving the order every man aboard has been waiting for and dreading in equal measure: strike all remaining sail but the storm trysail and a single reef jib, the smallest possible spread of canvas that will still let the helmsman keep some control over the ship's direction, rather than leaving her entirely at the mercy of wind and current. It's a tiny amount of sail for a vessel this size, barely enough to see from shore, and it is, paradoxically, the only survivable choice. Too much canvas in a storm this size doesn't speed you to safety. It knocks you flat, or worse, tears the rig apart entirely and leaves you drifting, rudderless, at the mercy of whatever the storm decides to do next. You find yourself, in the last stretch before full dark, working the pump alongside a man you don't know well, both of you soaked through, both of you past the point where your shoulders register individual strokes anymore. Just a continuous grinding ache that seems to belong to someone else's arms. Neither of you talks much. There isn't much to say that the work itself isn't already saying. Somewhere behind you, thunder finally catches up to the lightning, close enough now that the crack of it seems to arrive at the same instant as the flash, which every sailor aboard understands, without needing the arithmetic explained, means the storm has stopped announcing itself from a distance and started actually arriving. By full dark, the preparation is as complete as it will ever be. Hatches battened, guns lashed, topmasts down, pumps manned in relay, storm canvas set to its bare minimum, every loose object below decks tied down or stowed. It has taken the better part of 3 hours, roughly 60 men, 1 broken pair of fingers, and every ounce of collective experience this crew has accumulated across however many storms each of them has separately survived before tonight. There's no ceremony to mark the moment the work is finished. There's just the work itself. Done or not done, and the storm now deciding for itself whether it was enough. You climb down the ladder one last time before the worst of it arrives, back toward the space where your hammock still hangs, coiled and waiting exactly where you left it that morning, and you understand now, in a way you didn't a few hours ago, exactly how much invisible work goes into the simple fact of a ship surviving a bad night. It isn't luck. It's Dovey's oakum and 200 years of hammock engineering and a chain pump worked by aching shoulders and a helmsman's white-knuckled grip, all of it happening at once, all of it necessary, none of it guaranteed to be enough. You think, briefly, of every calm night over the past month when none of this seemed to matter at all. When the ropes were just ropes, the hatches just hatches, the whole apparatus of the ship simply background furniture to a pleasant voyage. It takes exactly one bad evening to reveal how much of that apparatus was quietly, constantly, working to keep you alive the entire time, whether you noticed it or not. Not every ship's crew got this far in their preparations before the storm arrived. Some storms simply moved faster than the warning the glass provided, or built strength in places no 18th century sailor had any way of forecasting days out. One particular ship, in one particular April a few years before your own story takes place, ran out of time to do most of what Davy and his crewmates just spent the last several hours doing. What happened to her, and to the roughly 146 men aboard her, is where this story turns next. A night with no Davy Prosser to save the barrel in time, and no shore anywhere close enough to matter. The wind that hit the Massachusetts coast on the night of April 26, 1717, didn't behave like a normal nor'easter, and the men aboard the ship at the centre of this next story didn't have Davy Prosser's 3 careful hours to prepare for it. What accounts survive describe a storm that built with unusual speed, even by the standards of a coastline notorious for sudden violent spring weather, waves that witnesses on shore, watching in horror as the scene unfolded barely a few hundred feet from the beach, would later describe as taller than anything in living memory, driving a heavily laden 3-masted galley directly onto a sandbar off what is now Wellfleet, on the outer arm of Cape Cod. The ship's hull, weakened by the pounding surf within minutes of striking bottom, began coming apart timber by timber while most of her crew were still aboard. Of the roughly 146 men who had sailed her into that storm, all but 2 would be dead before the sun came up. This is the story of the Wider Galley, the ship that gave the Golden Age of Piracy its wealthiest wreck and its cruelest lesson, that no amount of plunder and no amount of preparation guarantees a crew will see morning. It is also, as it happens, a story with an unusually well-documented ending, thanks to a piece of good fortune that most disasters of this era never receive. 2 men who lived to describe it, and a colonial court eager enough to hear their testimony that it wrote much of it down. To understand how she ended up on that sandbar, you have to go back roughly a year and a half, to a man history remembers, when it remembers him at all, as Samuel Bellamy, known to his own crew, according to the fragmentary record that survives him, as Black Sam, a nickname earned less from any particular cruelty than from his habit of wearing his own long dark hair tied back, rather than the powdered wig fashionable among gentlemen of the period. Bellamy was born around 1689 in the parish of Hittersley, in Devon, England, according to surviving parish records. One of the few hard biographical facts about him that historians consider reasonably solid, since most of what's commonly repeated about his early life comes from folklore layered on afterward, including a popular but unverifiable legend that he fell in love with a young Cape Cod woman named Maria Hallett and turned to piracy specifically to win her a fortune. It's a good story, the kind that gets repeated in tourist pamphlets and local histories up and down the Cape to this day. It's almost certainly at least partly invented, or at minimum unprovable, and it's worth saying so plainly rather than repeating it as settled fact. What's better documented is Bellamy's actual rise through the pirate world of the mid-1710s. He appears in the historical records sailing initially under Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founding figures of the loose pirate confederation operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas during those years, before splitting off with his own command sometime in 1716. By early 1717, Bellamy had assembled a small fleet of his own and was operating in the waters around the Bahamas and the Windward Passage, taking prizes with a reputation, again, filtered heavily through Captain Charles Johnson's dramatised 1724 account, which modern historians treat with considerable caution, for treating captured crews with unusual restraint by the standards of the trade, offering captured sailors the choice to join his crew rather than simply killing or marooning them outright. It's this reputation, more than anything Bellamy actually did, that survives in a reliable primary source, that gave rise to his enduring popular nickname as something like a maritime Robin Hood. A pirate who supposedly framed his own crimes as a kind of rough justice against the wealthy and powerful, a reputation that later centuries found considerably more romantic and useful than the actual grubbier business of piracy itself ever really was. Johnson's account puts a lengthy, eloquent speech in Bellamy's mouth, delivered to a captured merchant captain, contrasting the honest freedom of a pirate's life against the false respectability of men who robbed the poor from behind the law rather than a cutlass. It is vivid, quotable, and almost certainly substantially invented or embellished, the kind of stirring political philosophy a London writer, working 7 years after Bellamy's death from second-hand rumour and his own considerable narrative flair, was well positioned to supply and rather less well positioned to verify. Whatever Bellamy actually believed about kings, wealth, and the arbitrary nature of legitimate power, it likely bore only a rough resemblance to the polished monologue history remembers him for. On February 26, 1717, Bellamy's fleet caught up with a ship that would change the entire shape of his career. The Wider Galley, a purpose-built slave ship, launched in London barely 2 years earlier in 1715, on her return voyage from the Caribbean after delivering a cargo of enslaved Africans and taking on gold, silver, and trade goods in exchange. She was fast, designed to be, since speed mattered enormously in the transatlantic slave trade, and well armed, carrying 18 guns even before Bellamy got hold of her. It's worth pausing on that detail rather than letting it slide past unremarked. The ship that would go on to carry a notably diverse pirate crew, some of them formerly enslaved men sailing as full voting members of the company, had spent her working life until that February crossing the Atlantic packed with human cargo held in chains, bound for auction blocks in the Caribbean under conditions that killed a meaningful percentage of every voyage's captives before the crossing was even finished. The same hull, within a matter of weeks, went from an instrument of that trade to something considerably closer to its opposite. Not out of any abolitionist conviction on Bellamy's part, historians are careful to note, but simply because a pirate crew's practical need for hands willing to fight, and its own article's promise of an equal share regardless of a man's origin, created an opening that essentially nowhere else in the Atlantic world offered at the time. After a chase lasting several days, Bellamy's fleet caught her, and according to surviving depositions, the Whyda's original captain, Lawrence Prince, surrendered with minimal resistance. Bellamy, in what was apparently standard practice for him, gave Prince his own smaller vessel, the Sultana, in exchange, letting the merchant captain sail away with something rather than nothing, while Bellamy claimed the far superior ship for his own flagship. The crew refit her quickly, adding guns until she carried something closer to 28, making the Whyda one of the most heavily armed pirate vessels then operating anywhere in the Atlantic. For the next 2 months, the Whyda and her consort ships worked their way up the eastern seaboard of North America, taking prize after prize along a well-travelled shipping corridor, until by late April 1717, Bellamy's small fleet found itself off the coast of New England, having recently captured a sloop called the Mary Ann, loaded with a cargo of Madeira wine that several of Bellamy's crew had, by all later accounts, sampled rather enthusiastically before the fleet continued north. It's a small, human detail easy to lose in a story this dramatic, that some of the men who would die within days were, on their last ordinary evening, simply drunk on captured wine and glad of the prize, with absolutely no idea what the sky over the next 24 hours had planned for them. Bellamy's fleet by this point numbered several vessels sailing in loose company, a common arrangement among pirate crews of the period who found strength, resupply options, and a wider net for prizes in travelling together rather than alone. The Whyda herself as flagship, the smaller Mary Ann with her captured cargo of wine, and at least 1 or 2 other consorts whose names appear only inconsistently across the surviving record, a reminder that even a story this well documented still has real gaps in it. Command of the Mary Ann that night had been given over to a prize crew of 7 of Bellamy's own men, tasked with sailing her in company with the flagship up the coast, a decision that, as the storm closed in, would end up mattering enormously to which of Bellamy's crew lived to see another sunrise, and which did not. The storm found them on the 26th of April, somewhere off the outer coast of Cape Cod, and it found them with far less warning than Davy Prosser's crew had received on their own bad night. What survives in the historical record, largely reconstructed from Thomas Davis's own deposition, given after his capture, along with scattered eyewitness accounts from shore, describes conditions deteriorating with brutal speed, rising wind, driving rain, and seas that grew violent enough, in the space of a few hours, to separate the Whyda from the rest of Bellamy's small fleet entirely. Some of the accompanying vessels managed to claw enough sea room to survive the night relatively intact, scattering northward along the coast in the confusion and, according to fragmentary later reports, eventually making their way back toward friendlier waters in the Caribbean over the following weeks, their crews carrying the news of the Whyda's loss with them to ports where the story would spread over the following months through exactly the same word-of-mouth network that had carried news of the 1715 treasure fleet 2 years before. The Whyda, heavily laden with plunder and perhaps struggling under canvas that hadn't been reduced quickly enough for conditions this severe, did not have that luck. She struck the outer sandbar sometime after 10 at night, close enough to the beach at what is now Wellfleet that people on shore could reportedly see and hear the disaster unfolding, utterly unable to help. Local residents drawn out of their homes by the sound of the storm itself found themselves witnesses to something considerably worse than bad weather, flashes of what might have been the ship's guns firing distress signals, or simply the crack of her own timbers giving way, carried on wind too violent for any rescue boat to safely launch, even had one been readily available. Waves broke over her with enough force to start dismasting her almost immediately, and within what witnesses later estimated as perhaps an hour, the hull itself began breaking apart under the repeated pounding of surf against sand. Men who had spent the evening drinking captured Madeira found themselves, without any of Davy's 3 hours of preparation, simply fighting to stay alive in freezing April surf, in the dark, with a disintegrating ship coming apart around them and beneath them at the same time. Thomas Davis survived it. A Welsh ship's carpenter, pressed aboard like Davy Prosser in our earlier story, from a vessel Bellamy's crew had captured, valued too highly for his trade skills to be simply let go. Davis later testified that he clung to wreckage as the ship broke up around him, was thrown clear of the worst of the debris, and eventually washed up on the beach more dead than alive, one of only 2 men to make it to shore out of a crew historians generally place at somewhere close to 146. The other survivor was John Julian, a young mosquito man from the coast of what is now Nicaragua and Honduras, serving the Wider's crew as a pilot, a role mosquito sailors, prized throughout the Caribbean for their navigational skill and deep familiarity with reef-strewn coastal waters, frequently filled aboard both merchant and pirate vessels of the period. The 7 men aboard the Marianne that night fared rather differently, and their survival, together with Davis's own, is really what makes so much of this story knowable at all. Riding out the same storm in a smaller, more manoeuvrable vessel that never struck the sandbar the way the Wider did, they instead ran aground more gently in Cape Cod Bay, shaken but alive, and were taken into custody by local authorities within days, the same authorities who would soon also have Davis and Julian in hand from the beach at Wellfleet. Among the Marianne's crew were men whose names survive in the Boston trial record with a clarity most of the Wider's own drowned crew will never have. Thomas South, John Brown, Hendrik Quintor, Simon van Voorst, Peter Cornelius Hoof, and John Schwan appear across the surviving court documents, a rare list of individually named pirates from a crew otherwise reduced, for most of its members, to an anonymous total. Massachusetts authorities tried them together with Davis in the same October proceedings, even though Davis himself had come off the wrecked Wider rather than the more fortunate Marianne. 6 of the group were convicted, only Davis, arguing successfully that he'd never freely joined the crew at all, walked free. What happened to the 2 of them afterward diverges sharply, and the divergence tells its own quiet story about who counted as fully human under colonial law in 1717. Davis, as already described, stood trial alongside the Marianne's crew and walked free. John Julian's path was entirely different, and considerably less visible in the surviving record. John Julian's fate is harder to pin down with confidence, and where the record thins out, honesty requires saying so rather than filling the gap with a satisfying story. Fragmentary colonial records, pieced together by later historians researching the Wider's story, suggest Julian was not tried alongside the English and Welsh crewmen at all, but was instead sold into slavery by the colonial authorities who took him into custody, a fate that had nothing to do with anything he had personally done aboard the Wider, and everything to do with the fact that indigenous captives were, under the racial logic of colonial Massachusetts law, treated as property to be disposed of rather than defendants entitled to a piracy trial. Some later, less certain traditions surrounding the name John Julian suggest he may have eventually ended up enslaved on Cape Cod itself, living out decades of his life within a few miles of the very beach where he'd washed ashore in 1717. Though the documentary trail connecting that later record definitively to the Wider's own John Julian is thin enough that serious historians treat the connection as plausible rather than proven. If that account is accurate, and the surviving documentation is thin enough that reasonable historians disagree on some of the details, then the storm that killed 144 of his shipmates in a single night spared John Julian only to deliver him into a different kind of catastrophe entirely. One with no dramatic shipwreck and no hanging to mark its ending, just a name that appears and then quietly stops appearing in the colonial record. Samuel Bellamy himself never stood trial for any of it. He went down with his ship, one of the roughly 144 men the sea simply kept, his body, if it was ever recovered and identified at all amid the wreckage strewn across that stretch of beach, leaving no more of a documented trace than most of his crew did. Whatever legendary quotations Johnson's later, heavily dramatised account puts in his mouth, including a famous speech reportedly delivered to a captured merchant captain about the nature of freedom and the arbitrary line between kings and pirates, belong more properly to folklore than to verified history. The kind of stirring dialogue a storyteller invents 7 years after a man's death, when there's no one left alive to contradict him. What we can say with more confidence is simpler, and in its own way, sadder. A 28-year-old sea captain who had spent less than 2 years as a pirate, commanding one of the most heavily armed ships in the Atlantic, drowned within sight of the Massachusetts shoreline, on a beach where curious onlookers would spend the following days combing the wreckage for anything valuable that washed. Up. Colonial Governor Samuel Schutte dispatched men to investigate the wreck site within days, and salvagers, some official, most decidedly not, picked over what the surf delivered onto the beach for weeks afterward, drawn by the same simple ancient logic that drew Henry Jennings and his crew to a different Spanish wreck 2 years earlier. A fortune sitting unguarded on a public beach rarely stays. Unguarded for long. Coins in particular kept washing ashore for months, a slow-motion scattering of the Wider's plundered wealth across the outer Cape sand, gathered up by local residents who had, until that April, never expected a fortune to simply arrive with the tide. The bulk of what the ship carried, though, went down with her, settling into the sand and surf off Wellfleet, where it would remain undisturbed for a span of time longer than the entire history of the United States that would eventually form around it. 267 years, in fact, before anyone found it again, but that part of the story belongs later in tonight's journey, not here. Sit with the number for a moment before we move on. 146 men, by most careful estimates, aboard a ship on the evening of April 26, 1717. 144 of them dead by morning. 2 men alive on a cold beach. One of them about to argue successfully for his life in a Boston courtroom. The other about to vanish from history in a way no court record fully explains. It is, by a wide margin, one of the deadliest single nights in the entire recorded history of Atlantic piracy. Deadlier, in raw numbers, than most of the era's famous battles and executions combined, and yet it rarely gets the same attention in popular retellings that a single hanging or a single dramatic duel does. Perhaps because a storm makes for a less satisfying villain than a rival captain or a vengeful colonial governor. There's no one to blame. There's no trial to follow, no gallows scene to describe, just weather doing exactly what weather does. Indifferent to the fact that it happened to be doing it to 146 specific men, with names, habits, families, and in most cases, absolutely no warning at all. Whatever your own ship is enduring right now. Back where we left you hauling on the pumps with Davy Prosser's crushed fingers freshly bandaged below, it is worth remembering, hanging there in your own hammock in your own storm, that the difference between a survivable bad night and a catastrophe like the Wider's often came down to nothing more dramatic than a few hours' warning, a sandbar half a mile closer to shore than anyone realised, and the simple, arbitrary mathematics of which way the wind decided to blow. The sea, on nights like this, was never interested in who deserved to live. Your own storm is nowhere near finished yet. Let's go back below decks, into the dark, and find out what it actually feels like to ride one out from the inside. There's a particular kind of darkness below decks that doesn't feel like darkness anywhere else. With the hatches battened and every lantern extinguished except the single one allowed near the binnacle above, the space you've called home for the last month has become something closer to the inside of a drum being struck, repeatedly, by something considerably larger than any drumstick has a right to be. You can't see your own hand in front of your face. You can hear absolutely everything, the groan of the hull working against itself, timber flexing in ways timber isn't supposed to flex, the muffled roar of wind that has stopped sounding like weather and started sounding like something alive and furious just on the other side of 2 inches of oak. Your hammock, when you finally find it by touch alone, is swinging in arcs that would have seemed impossible a month ago, not the gentle sway you'd grown fond of, but wild jerking swings that carry you nearly to the beams overhead on one roll and drop you nearly level with men sleeping below on the next. Your stomach doesn't so much lurch as simply give up trying to stay in one place, and you understand, in a purely physical sense you never expected to learn firsthand, exactly why sailors called seasickness something closer to a universal experience than a personal failing. Even Abel, passing nearby on some errand you can't see in the dark, sounds less than entirely steady himself, and if a man who spent 20 years at sea can still be caught off guard by a night like this, you stop feeling quite so embarrassed about your own knees not entirely cooperating. Somewhere further off, you hear him swear, briefly and without much heat, at a line that slipped its cleat, and the ordinariness of it, a grown man annoyed at a rope in the middle of what might be the worst night of your life, is oddly steadying. This is, somehow, still better than the alternative. You watch, or rather feel, since seeing anything is out of the question. A man near you who gave up on his hammock and tried to brace himself against the deck instead get thrown a full body length across the space when the ship takes a particularly savage roll, cracking his shoulder against a support beam hard enough that you hear the impact over the general roar. The hammock isn't comfortable tonight. It has stopped even pretending to be comfortable. But it is, mathematically, still doing exactly the one job it was built to do 400 years ago on a beach in the Bahamas, keeping your body's weight centered, swinging with the ship rather than being flung by it, turning what should be a night of broken bones into a night of nausea and terror instead. Small mercies. You'll take them. You're not alone in the dark, not by a long way, and one voice nearby belongs to a boy who can't be older than 13, gripping the edge of his own hammock with both hands like it's the only solid thing left in the world. His name is Isaiah Fenn, and you'd noticed him before tonight only in passing. A powder monkey, one of the crew's youngest hands, whose entire job in a fight is running gunpowder charges from the ship's magazine up to the guns fast enough to keep a battery firing. A role given to boys specifically because their small size let them move quickly through cramped passageways adult men couldn't manage nearly as fast. Isaiah had been an orphan working the Bristol docks before a merchant captain took him on as cabin boy 2 years back, and when that merchant ship got taken by this crew 4 months ago, Isaiah simply stayed. The transition from merchant service to pirate crew mattering rather less to a hungry 13-year-old than the fact that pirate crews, by the terms of their own articles, generally fed their boys the same rations as their men. He'd told you as much, weeks ago, without any particular bitterness in it, just a boy's plain accounting of where the better deal happened to be found. Isaiah isn't handling tonight well, and there's no shame in that. You're not handling it particularly well yourself. Somewhere in the dark you hear him being quietly, thoroughly sick into a bucket that several other men are also using in rotation, the specific misery of shipboard seasickness made considerably worse by total darkness, an emotion too violent to predict. The smell below decks, already unpleasant on an ordinary day, has become something you'll remember for the rest of your life whether you want to or not. Bilge water sloshing louder and higher than usual, vomit, the sour reek of 60 frightened men sweating in a sealed space, and underneath it all, the persistent tang of tar and hemp that never quite leaves a wooden ship, no matter how bad the night gets. You breathe through your mouth and try not to think too hard about any single component of it. By what you guess is somewhere close to midnight, though there's no reliable way to check, the storm has settled into a rhythm of its own, not calmer exactly, but consistent, wave after wave slamming the hull in a pattern your body starts, despite everything, to anticipate. Someone near the ladder is praying out loud, low and steady, the kind of prayer that isn't really asking for anything specific anymore, just repeating familiar words, because familiar words are the only comfort left available in a space with no light and no solid ground. Nobody tells him to stop. A few other voices, here and there in the dark, quietly join in on the parts they know, by what you guess is somewhere close to midnight, though there's no reliable way to check. The storm has settled into a rhythm of its own, not calmer, exactly, but consistent, wave after wave slamming the hull in a pattern your body starts, despite everything, to anticipate. Someone near the ladder is praying out loud, low and steady, the kind of prayer that isn't really asking for anything specific anymore, just repeating familiar words, because familiar words are the only comfort left available in a space with no light and no solid ground. Nobody tells him to stop. A few other voices, here and there in the dark, quietly join in on the parts they know. Not every voice in the dark is quite so gentle. A few berths over, you catch fragments of a different kind of talk, low, tense, half-serious in the way frightened men sometimes are when they're looking for someone, anyone, to blame for a storm that has no actual person responsible for it. Somebody brings up a hand who came aboard only 2 prizes back, muttering that he'd whistled on deck the week before, that he'd worn green without anyone telling him better, that a storm this bad on a voyage this otherwise lucky had to be somebody's fault. Another voice, older and steadier, tells him flatly to save his breath for bailing, that the seas never once cared what colour a man's coat was. It's the same instinct that will get its own full accounting later in this story. The pull, deep and old and almost impossible to shake even among hardened men, to find a single cause for a disaster too large and impersonal to otherwise make sense of. Tonight it stays just talk, low mutters swallowed up by the noise of the storm before they can become anything worse. Not every night stays that way. But that's a story for later too. Loose gear you'd thought was secured makes itself known in the dark in ways that do nothing for anyone's nerves. A chest sliding a few inches against its lashing with each hard roll, a coil of spare rope working loose from its peg and thumping softly against the deck somewhere out of sight. The particular groan of a beam flexing under strain that every experienced hand seems able to distinguish. By sound alone, from a beam simply doing its ordinary job. You've learned over the last several hours an entire vocabulary of creaks and groans you never knew existed, the ship's own language for describing exactly how frightened it is. There's a sound, sometime after midnight, that cuts through everything else, a sharp crack from somewhere forward, followed almost immediately by a rush of water and a chorus of shouted alarm. A seam has opened somewhere near the bow, one of the very joints Davy Prosser spent the afternoon checking with his calloused thumb, and now it's letting the sea in faster than the pumps alone can keep up with. You hear Davy's voice before you see him, impossible to miss even in total darkness, hoarse from 3 hours of shouting instructions, directing men toward the breach one-handed, his freshly bandaged left hand held awkwardly against his chest, while his right does the work of 2. He can't drive oakum into a failing seam properly with one hand, not the way the job actually needs doing, so he talks another sailor through it instead, guiding blind fingers to exactly the right spot by feel and memory, describing the seam's shape from a day's worth of familiarity with every inch of this hull. It takes the better part of 20 minutes, and by the end of it, Davy's voice has gone from hoarse to barely a whisper, but the water slows to a manageable trickle, and the pumps, worked now by exhausted men in even shorter shifts than before, start winning the fight again. It takes the better part of 20 minutes, and by the end of it, Davy's voice has gone from hoarse to barely a whisper, but the water slows to a manageable trickle, and the pumps, worked now by exhausted men in even shorter shifts than before, start winning the fight again. Someone nearby, in the sudden slackening of tension once the leak is under control, mutters something about how a shipwright's apprentice from Bristol turned out to be worth more to this crew tonight than the entire gun deck put together, and for the first time in hours, you hear something that might almost, in the dark, pass for a laugh. It's the pirate equivalent of a group chat suddenly going quiet with relief after someone finally lands the plane. If the plane in question were made of oak and the landing strip were an active hurricane. It's worth understanding, sitting there in the dark listening to Davy talk another man's hands through a failing seam, just how ordinary a night like this actually was for sailors of this era, however extraordinary it felt to you. Storms, not combat, not disease, not even the gallows waiting at the end of a captured pirate's story, were the single most common cause of death for ordinary sailors throughout the age of sail. A hazard so routine that ship's logs from the period record foundering, dismasting, and total loss with a matter-of-fact brevity that can look to modern eyes almost shockingly casual. A man who went to sea in the early 1700s accepted, as a basic condition of the trade, that any given voyage might simply end with the ship not arriving anywhere at all. You hadn't fully understood that acceptance until tonight. You understand it considerably better now, hanging in a swinging hammock in total darkness, listening to a one-handed carpenter save your life by voice alone. Isaiah, it turns out, has a job tonight too, small as he is, running word between the deck and the hold whenever the ladder needs someone light and fast enough to move through the chaos without adding to it, carrying instructions down from the quartermaster to whichever section of the crew needs them fastest. He does it 3 times that you count, disappearing up into the noise and returning soaked through and shaking each time, and on his 3rd trip back down he finds his way to the space near your hammock and simply sits, back against a barrel, breathing hard, saying nothing for a long moment. Then, in the dark, in a voice trying very hard to sound steadier than it actually is it always like this? You don't have an honest answer for him. Neither, you suspect, does anyone else aboard. Not really. Every storm is its own storm, and no amount of experience makes the next one predictable. Here's what nobody tells you. Back when you first learned to sling a hammock in calm weather a month ago, the swinging motion that felt almost like a lullaby on an easy night becomes, in weather like this, something closer to a controlled fall, over and over, dozens of times an hour, your body accepting a violence that would genuinely injure you if you tried to fight it instead. The trick, and every experienced hand aboard seems to know this instinctively, the way you know to relax rather than tense up before a hard landing, is to go slack rather than rigid, to let the canvas do exactly what it was designed to do rather than gripping the sides and trying to hold yourself artificially still. Isaiah, exhausted past the point of fear, finally climbs back into his own hammock sometime in the small hours and does exactly this, going almost limp, letting the wild swinging carry him rather than fighting it, and within what feels like minutes. Despite everything, despite the noise and the water and the very real possibility that tonight ends badly for all of you, he's actually, genuinely asleep. There's something almost unbearably tender about it, a 13-year-old boy who spent the evening running messages through a collapsing storm and helping steady a one-handed carpenter's repair, finally surrendering to exhaustion in a swinging rope bed built on a 400-year-old idea, while the storm that might kill him rages on entirely without his permission or participation. Toward what you guess is 2 a.m, the ship takes the worst roll of the entire night, hard enough that for one genuinely terrifying moment, hanging nearly sideways in your hammock, you're certain she's not coming back up. Every man still awake in the dark seems to hold his breath at once, a collective silence more total than anything the storm itself has managed all night. She does come back up, groaning the whole way, timbers protesting in a long, drawn-out complaint that seems to last far longer than the roll itself. And somewhere in the darkness you hear someone let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the specific kind of laugh that only comes from surviving something you were fully prepared not to survive. It isn't relief exactly. It's closer to astonishment. The ship, incredibly, is still a ship. By what must be close to dawn, though no daylight can reach you below decks to confirm it, the rhythm of the waves against the hull has begun, almost imperceptibly at first, to soften. The gaps between the worst rolls stretch longer. The roar beyond the hull loses some of its fury, settling from something like a scream into something closer to a very angry conversation. Davy's voice, still hoarse, passes word down the length of the deck that the pumps are gaining, rather than just holding even, which is the first genuinely good news anyone has heard in what feels like a lifetime. You realise only once the fear starts to ease just how exhausted you actually are. Not the pleasant tiredness of hard honest work, but something deeper, the specific bone weariness of a body that has spent an entire night braced for catastrophe. Every muscle held ready for a blow that this time never quite landed. Isaiah wakes before full light, blinking in the grey dimness now filtering faintly through the seams of the still battened hatches, and finds you still awake, still watching the swinging shapes of hammocks all around you settle gradually back toward their ordinary gentle rhythm. He doesn't say much. He doesn't need to. There's a particular kind of relief that doesn't require words. The simple physical fact of two people who weren't sure they'd see morning discovering, together, that they have. He tells you eventually in a small voice that this was his third real storm since coming aboard, and that it never once got easier to be afraid of, no matter how many times a person survived one. You believe him completely. Somewhere nearby, Davy Prosser is finally mercifully asleep himself, his bandaged hand cradled against his chest, having spent the worst hours of the night keeping a dying seam from becoming a drowning one, one-handed, by voice alone. You don't know yet how many storms like this you'll survive before your own luck runs out. The way Bellamy's crew's luck ran out a few years and a few 100 miles from where you're lying right now. Tonight, at least, wasn't that night. Tonight, the hammock held, the pumps won, and a 13-year-old boy who ran messages through a collapsing storm is sleeping soundly a few feet from where you're finally starting to drift off yourself. Safe for now in a rope bed that has been keeping men like you alive since long before either of you was born. Somewhere above, once real daylight finally breaks, the crew will spend the better part of the coming day restepping the topmasts, rebending sail, pumping the last of the standing water out of the hold, and taking stock of exactly what the night cost, a few cracked ribs. Davy's crushed fingers already darkening toward the deep bruised black they'll stay for weeks, a spar or two that will need replacing at the next port, a torn strake that will keep the ship's actual carpenter, one-handed and exhausted as he is, busy for days once the weather finally allows it. It could have cost far more. It has, for other crews, on other nights, cost everything, the way it cost the Wider's crew, everything only a couple of years before. For now, though, in the grey hush of a storm finally spending itself out, you let your body go slack in the swinging canvas one more time, and, despite everything, despite the ache in every muscle and the salt still stinging your eyes, you actually sleep. Your ship survived because of 100 small, unglamorous decisions made correctly, a glass read carefully, a topmast struck in time, a carpenter who kept working with a ruined hand rather than stopping to nurse it. There's no single dramatic act of heroism to point to, no one moment that saved everyone, just dozens of ordinary men doing exhausting, unglamorous jobs correctly, over and over, for most of a night, because the alternative to doing them correctly wasn't a lesser outcome, but no outcome at all. Not every crew in these waters got that combination of luck and competence in the same measure. Some got neither. 2 years before your own storm, in fact a far larger disaster had already reshaped the entire pirate world you now belong to, sending an entire Spanish treasure fleet to the bottom of the ocean and in the process quite literally creating the community of men you now call your crewmates. On the night of July 30th into the early morning of July 31st, 1715, a hurricane caught 11 ships strung out along the Atlantic coast of Florida, somewhere between what is now Sebastian Inlet and Fort Pierce, and by the time the wind finally eased, 10 of those 11 ships were wrecked on the reefs and sandbars just offshore, their hulls broken open, their cargo scattered across shallow water that would keep giving up silver coins to anyone willing to dive for them for the next 300 years. Roughly 1,000 people, by the more careful modern estimates, passengers and crew, both. Men, women, and at least some children travelling as family members of officials returning home, drowned that night or died in the days immediately after, stranded on an unfamiliar coastline with no fresh water, no shelter, and Spanish authorities in Havana who had no idea, for days, that anything had gone wrong at all. Some estimates run somewhat lower, closer to 700 or 800, others, factoring in likely undercounted deaths among lower-ranking sailors and enslaved crew whose names rarely made it into official Spanish paperwork at all, run higher. The uncertainty itself says something about whose deaths got carefully recorded in 1715 and whose didn't. This is the story of a storm most people have never heard of. Despite the fact that it did something almost no other single weather event in Atlantic history managed, it didn't just sink ships. It helped invent an entire era of piracy, The fleet that sailed from Havana on July 24, 1715, was carrying an almost unimaginable fortune, even by the standards of a period when Spanish treasure fleets routinely carried more wealth in a single crossing than most European kingdoms saw in a year. 10 Spanish vessels and 1 French ship travelled together under armed escort, loaded with silver pesos minted in Mexico City. Gold coins and bars, work jewellery, and other New World treasure being shipped back to Spain to fund a war-strained crown. The fleet had actually been delayed a full year beyond its normal sailing schedule by the War of the Spanish Succession, meaning this single convoy carried an unusually concentrated backlog of colonial wealth all at once. A year's worth of delayed shipments compressed into a single, catastrophically vulnerable crossing. Modern estimates of the fleet's total cargo value run into the tens of millions of dollars in today's money, though putting a precise figure on it depends heavily on which specific coins and goods you're counting and at what era's prices. And reasonable historians and treasure researchers still argue about the exact total to this day. The fleet's timing could hardly have been worse. Hurricane season in the Caribbean and along the Florida coast runs roughly from June through November, a pattern well known to Spanish navigators of the period even without modern meteorology to formalize it, and a fleet already running a year behind schedule had correspondingly less flexibility to simply wait out a bad season in port. Sailing north along the Florida coast, riding the Gulf Stream current that had carried Spanish treasure fleets safely home for nearly 2 centuries, the convoy ran directly into a hurricane that modern researchers, working backward from surviving accounts and known storm patterns, estimate may have reached major hurricane strength, with winds well in excess of 100 miles an hour by the time it reached the fleet's position. What happened next unfolded with a speed that echoes, in miniature, everything you already know about how quickly conditions can turn from manageable to catastrophic at sea. Ship after ship was driven onto the reefs and shoals lining that stretch of Florida coastline, their hulls stove in by the same repeated pounding that nearly claimed the wider 2 years later, farther north. Survivors who managed to reach shore found themselves stranded along an unfamiliar and largely uninhabited stretch of coastline, with little fresh water, minimal food, and injuries ranging from broken bones to the kind of exposure that killed slowly over the following days rather than quickly in the surf itself. It would be roughly 3 days before word of the disaster reached Spanish authorities in St. Augustine, and considerably longer before any organised rescue and salvage effort could actually be mounted. Spain's response, once news finally reached the colonial authorities who could act on it, was to establish a salvage camp directly on the beach nearest the largest concentration of wrecks. A semi-permanent settlement of soldiers, officials and hired divers, many of them enslaved or free black divers whose skill at working underwater without modern equipment was, by this period, well documented and highly valued throughout Spanish Caribbean salvage operations. Working in relatively shallow water close to shore, these divers recovered a substantial portion of the fleet's treasure over the following months and years. Historians estimate somewhere in the range of most of the silver eventually being recovered through official Spanish salvage efforts. Though a meaningful amount was never found at all, some of it still turning up on Florida beaches after storms even in the 21st century. Here's where the story of a natural disaster starts becoming, unmistakably, the story of your own profession. News of the wreck and the fortune sitting in shallow water off the Florida coast spread through the Caribbean fast, the way any story involving unguarded gold tends to travel, and it reached ears considerably less scrupulous than the Spanish Crown's official salvage teams. Fishermen, small-time traders, and outright opportunists from English colonies in the Bahamas and Jamaica began sailing to the wreck site themselves, some diving independently for whatever the Spanish camp's official operation hadn't yet claimed, others simply waiting for an opportunity to take by force what Spain had already recovered. Word of a fortune sitting in water shallow enough for an ordinary swimmer to reach it, guarded by a garrison too small to watch every mile of exposed coastline at once, was never going to stay a Spanish secret for long in a region this thick with idle, opportunistic sailors. Chief among them was Henry Jennings, a Jamaica-based privateer whose name appears throughout the historical record of this period in ways considerably better documented than most of his contemporaries. In early 1716, commanding a small flotilla of armed vessels, Jennings led a direct raid on the Spanish salvage camp itself, overwhelming its modest garrison and making off with a substantial haul of already recovered silver, reportedly somewhere in the neighbourhood of 350,000 pesos. Though, as with most treasure figures from this period, the exact number is disputed and likely inflated in some retellings. It was, by any reasonable definition, an act of open piracy against a nation England was not at war with, and Jennings knew it. Rather than returning to a Jamaican port where colonial authorities might feel obligated to prosecute him for it, he and his crew sailed instead to a small, poorly governed harbour on the island of New Providence, in the Bahamas. That harbour was Nassau, and what happened there over the following 2 years is, in many ways, the direct origin story of the entire Golden Age of Piracy that produced the ship you're currently sailing on. Nassau in 1716 had essentially no functioning colonial government. The Bahamas' previous governance had collapsed years earlier under a combination of Spanish and French raids and general neglect from London, leaving the harbour a genuine power vacuum with excellent natural defences, and a deep, sheltered anchorage perfectly suited to ships that needed to careen, resupply, and disappear from official notice for months at a time. A ship could run aground on the harbour's sandbar in an emergency and simply wait out pursuit, something no proper naval vessel of the period could easily manage, and the surrounding waters were shallow and reef-strewn enough that larger, better-armed men of war sent to root the pirates out frequently couldn't follow them in at all. Jennings and his crew, flush with Spanish silver and with nowhere else particularly welcoming to spend it, settled in. Other captains and crews, many of them men who had themselves been drawn to the Florida coast by rumours of easy treasure, followed. Within roughly 2 years, Nassau had become the closest thing the Golden Age of Piracy ever had to an actual capital. A loosely organised pirate confederation historians have since nicknamed the Flying Gang, populated by a rotating cast of captains, whose names would go on to become the most recognisable in the entire era, running a rough, informal system of shared rules and mutual protection that let dozens of independent crews coexist in one crowded harbour without simply destroying each other over territory or plunder. Benjamin Hornigold, the man who first commanded Samuel Bellamy before Bellamy struck out with his own ship. Edward Teach, better known to history as Blackbeard, who spent time in Nassau's harbour before embarking on the campaign of terror that made his name synonymous with piracy itself. Charles Vane. Calico Jack Rackham, an entire generation of pirates, drawn together in a lawless Bahamian port that existed, in a very real sense, because a hurricane sank a Spanish treasure fleet off the coast of Florida the year before most of them arrived. It's worth sitting with the scale of that connection for a moment, because it's easy, hearing it told this quickly, to lose track of just how directly one event led to the next. A hurricane, a genuinely indifferent natural disaster with no allegiance to any flag or cause, killed roughly 1,000 people on a single bad night in July of 1715. The wealth that storm scattered across a few miles of shallow Florida water drew opportunists from across the Caribbean, one of whom used it to fund a raid that made him too hot to return safely home. That raid put him, and the men who followed his example, into a specific harbour with specific geography that happened to be perfectly suited to exactly the kind of organised lawlessness the Golden Age of Piracy required to flourish. Without the 1715 fleet, without that specific hurricane, hitting that specific coastline, on that specific night, it's entirely possible the loose confederation of pirates operating out of Nassau over the following years simply never coalesces in quite the same way, at quite the same scale, with quite the same roster of now famous names. That stretch of Florida coastline still carries the fleet's memory in its modern nickname. Locals and treasure hunters alike have called it the Treasure Coast for generations, and it's not an exaggeration or a marketing invention. Silver coins from the 1715 wreck have genuinely continued washing ashore there for 3 centuries. particularly after strong storms churn up the seafloor near the original wreck sites, to the point that modern treasure hunting operations, working under licenses from the state of Florida, still recover meaningful quantities of period-accurate Spanish silver most years even now. A disaster old enough to have helped invent an entire genre of piracy is, remarkably, still actively giving up its cargo to anyone patient enough to look for it. There's a grim symmetry worth naming plainly here too, one that sits uncomfortably alongside all the romance popular history tends to attach to pirate origin stories. The men who built careers, fortunes and legends out of the 1715 wreck silver did so on the back of roughly 1,000 deaths that receive, in most tellings of the Golden Age of Piracy, barely a passing mention. Spanish sailors, colonial officials and the family members travelling with them, women and children among the drowned, according to surviving passenger, manifests from at least some of the fleet's vessels, ordinary families making the crossing home alongside soldiers and treasure rather than any romantic notion of adventure, paid the actual cost of the disaster that funded an entire era of swashbuckling legend. Somewhere among that 1,000 were people who had spent the voyage worrying about entirely mundane things: seasickness, homesickness, the tedium of a crossing that had already run a year late, with no idea at all that the very last night of that crossing would be the one that killed them. It is, in miniature, the same asymmetry that runs through so much of this story. The storm doesn't care who profits from what it leaves behind. It only cares about wind and water and the arithmetic of which hull can withstand which wave. Everything that comes after, the raid, the harbour, the legends, the songs written 200 years later, is simply what people do with a disaster once the disaster itself is finished, deciding who lives and who doesn't. Your own captain, as it happens, has his own thin thread of connection to that history, the kind of detail that gets mentioned once over a rum ration and then rarely brought up again. Word among the older hands is that he sailed briefly with one of the smaller opportunist crews that worked the Florida wreck site in its earliest, most chaotic months, before the Spanish salvage operation tightened its guard and the easy pickings dried up. He doesn't talk about it much himself, and when Abel brought it up once, weeks ago, the captain only allowed that there was money on that beach for anyone willing to get their boots wet, which is either a modest way of describing a formative chapter of his life, or a captain's practiced way of deflecting a question he'd rather not answer in detail. Whether that's entirely true or the kind of embellishment that attaches itself to any captain with enough years at sea, you have no real way of confirming. But it's not an unusual story to hear, not on this ship, not in these waters, in this particular decade. An entire generation of the men you now sail alongside got their start, one way or another, tracing back to that one impossibly deadly night off the Florida coast. Storm-made opportunists building storm-made fortunes, in a trade whose founding myth turns out, on close inspection, to have quite a lot of actual drowning at the bottom of it, however rarely that part makes it into the songs. The fleet had sailed under two separate commanders travelling together for mutual protection, as was standard Spanish practice for a cargo this valuable. General Juan Esteban de Ubilla leading the Tierra Firme fleet up from Cartagena and Portobello, and General Antonio de Echeverri Zubisa commanding a smaller group of vessels from the Nueva Esparra fleet out of Veracruz. The two groups combining at Havana for the final, most dangerous leg of the journey home. Ubilla's own flagship, a vessel named the Nuestra Señora de la Regla, was among the ships lost that night. Ubilla himself drowned along with the great majority of his crew, one of the highest-ranking Spanish officials to die in a single maritime disaster in decades. Echeverri, aboard a different vessel, survived the wreck itself, though his own ship was among those destroyed on the reef. What survives of eyewitness testimony from the disaster, filtered through Spanish officials' later reports and the depositions of surviving officers, describes a night that, in its broad shape, would sound entirely familiar to you after your own recent storm, rising wind through the evening. A fleet that had perhaps left itself too little sea room between the Florida coast and the deepening, danger of the Gulf Stream's edge, and then, in the space of a few hours, ship after ship losing steerage entirely and being driven, essentially helpless, onto reefs that none of the fleet's pilots had any real hope of avoiding once the wind reached its full strength. Unlike Davy Prosser's crew, with 3 careful hours to strike topmasts and batten hatches, the 1715 fleet had a coastline working against it that your own ship never had to contend with. Reefs close enough to shore that a driven ship had almost no room to recover before running aground, turning what might otherwise have been a survivable storm at open sea into a catastrophic string of total losses along a few miles of Florida coastline. The salvage operation that followed relied overwhelmingly on divers whose skill made the entire recovery effort possible in the first place, and it's worth naming that plainly, rather than letting the story skip past them the way most popular retellings do. Free and enslaved black divers, many of them experienced in techniques developed across generations of Caribbean and West African diving traditions, worked the wreck sites in water shallow enough to reach without any mechanical equipment beyond their own lungs and simple weighted lines, diving repeatedly to depths of 20 or 30 feet to locate and raise silver that had scattered across the seafloor when each hull broke apart. Spanish records from the period document substantial quantities of treasure recovered through exactly this kind of unglamorous, physically brutal labour, performed by men whose individual names rarely survive in the official record, even though their skill directly determined how much of the fleet's fortune Spain ultimately recovered at all. Jennings's raid on the salvage camp, when it came in early 1716, was carried out with enough force and enough advanced planning that Spanish accounts of the incident describe the camp's small garrison offering only token resistance before the silver already stacked and ready for transport back to Havana was simply loaded onto Jennings's own ships instead. Spanish colonial correspondence from the period, preserved in archives on both sides of the Atlantic, treats the raid as exactly the act of piracy it plainly was, regardless of how English colonial authorities in Jamaica chose to characterize it at the time. England and Spain were nominally at peace. Jennings and his crew simply didn't let that technicality slow them down, and neither, as it turned out, did the Jamaican governor who might have been expected to prosecute him for it, but seems to have found the whole affair considerably less urgent than Madrid did. By the time word of Jennings's success had circulated through the Caribbean's tightly connected community of privateers, smugglers, and idle sailors, a community considerably smaller and more interconnected than the vast expanse of ocean it operated across might suggest, Nassau's transformation from sleepy, ungoverned harbour into the era's most notorious pirate stronghold was already well underway. There's one more thing worth understanding about a disaster on this scale, something the sailors on your own ship know instinctively, even if none of them could ever have explained the 1715 hurricane's exact path or death toll. A storm that kills that many people doesn't just leave behind treasure and opportunity, it leaves behind stories, omens, and a particular kind of dread that gets passed down through an entire seafaring culture, whispered about in ways considerably less rational than anything Davy Prosser's careful oakum work or Abel's careful hammock knots represent. Every sailor who has ever heard the story of the 1715 fleet, and by 1720 most of them have carried some version of that dread aboard with them. Whether they'd admit it aloud or not, folded in alongside 100 other half-believed rules about what a ship should never do if it hopes to see calm water again. Which brings us, finally, to what men on ships like yours actually believed about storms themselves, not the practical mechanics of surviving one which you've already learnt firsthand, but the older, stranger beliefs about what caused them, what warned of them, and what a frightened crew might do to try to keep one from finding their ship at all. Weeks after the storm that nearly took Davy Prosser's hand, you're standing at the rail on a grey, unsettled afternoon, watching a newer hand named Corwin Ashby toss a battered tin whistle over the side without a word of explanation to anyone. Corwin's been aboard barely a fortnight, taken off a captured merchant brig along with 2 others, and you'd noticed him carrying that whistle around since he came aboard, the kind of small personal possession a man holds onto out of simple habit rather than any particular attachment, something to fidget with during a slow watch. Now it's gone, swallowed by grey water, and Corwin looks distinctly relieved to be rid of it. You ask him why. "Heard a man whistling below deck this morning," he says, not quite meeting your eye. "Bad enough on a fair day. Worse with the glass looking like it does." Here's the thing about whistling aboard a ship in this era. The superstition around it wasn't simple, and it wasn't even entirely consistent from one crew to the next, which is itself worth understanding before dismissing the whole thing as nonsense. Sailors across multiple maritime traditions genuinely believed that whistling could summon wind, useful, even necessary, on a becalmed ship going nowhere for lack of any breeze at all, and there are documented accounts of sailors whistling softly, almost like a plea, hoping to coax a dead sail back to life. But that same belief flipped entirely once a storm was already brewing or already underway. Whistling into wind that already existed and already threatened violence wasn't calling for help. It was, in the logic of the superstition, actively inviting more wind than anyone wanted, tempting exactly the kind of disaster every man aboard had spent the last several weeks trying to avoid. The same act, in other words, carried opposite meanings depending entirely on what the sky was already doing, a fine distinction that a nervous new hand like Corwin apparently decided wasn't worth risking. Whistle or no whistle. You've noticed too that Corwin has become the subject of a particular kind of scrutiny over the past week that has nothing to do with his actual work, which by all accounts is perfectly competent. He splices line as well as any man his age, takes his turn at the pump without complaint, and hasn't once shirked a watch since coming aboard. It started small, someone remarking that the wind had turned foul the same day Corwin came aboard, which is true only in the sense that weather turns foul roughly as often as it turns fair, and someone else noting that he'd worn a green neckcloth on his first day, a colour some sailors considered unlucky at sea, for reasons nobody could ever quite explain to your satisfaction. By itself, none of it means much. Together, muttered in low voices near the forecastle, it's starting to sound like something with a name, the beginnings of a crew deciding, without quite saying so out loud, that they might have taken a Jonah aboard. The term itself comes from Scripture, the Old Testament story of the prophet Jonah, thrown overboard by his own shipmates during a storm after the crew concluded, through casting lots, that his presence aboard was the reason God had sent the tempest in the first place. Whether any individual sailor aboard your ship could recite the biblical story in detail is beside the point. The concept had long since detached itself from its scriptural origin and become simple maritime shorthand for any person believed, rightly or wrongly, to bring misfortune with them wherever they sailed. Ships' logs and later sailors' memoirs from across the 18th and 19th centuries record the label being applied, sometimes in jest and sometimes in dead earnest, to everyone from unlucky passengers to entire unlucky vessels, a way of assigning a human face, however unfairly, to disasters that were in every practical sense caused by nothing more sinister than wind, current and probability. It rarely goes anywhere good when a crew fully convinces itself it has found its Jonah, and you find yourself, over the following days, quietly hoping this doesn't become one of those times, watching Corwin's shoulders stay a little too tense even during ordinary work, a man doing his best to seem unbothered by talk he can clearly hear perfectly well. Abel, when you mention it to him privately, doesn't dismiss the whole business the way you half expected him to. Every crew wants someone to blame when the sea gets ugly, he tells you, working a knot with his ruined hand as steady as ever, not once looking up from the rope while he says it. Easier than blaming the sea itself. Can't do anything to the sea. He pauses, glances toward where Corwin is coiling line with perfectly ordinary competence, and adds, won't let it go further than talk. Not on this ship. You believe him, mostly because Abel has never once told you something he didn't intend to see through. But you also notice he starts finding small reasons to keep Corwin working near him over the following days, the kind of quiet, unofficial protection that doesn't announce itself as protection at all. The storm that had prompted Corwin's whistle-tossing that afternoon builds through the evening without ever quite breaking. One of those long, grey, threatening nights that never fully commits to violence, but never fully lets a crew relax either. It's during the worst of the waiting, well after dark, that you see it for the first time. A pale, bluish-white glow flickering at the very tip of the mainmast, dancing along the yardarms like something burning that somehow isn't consuming anything. Several of the older hands go quiet at the sight of it, a few muttering what sounds like a quick, half-remembered prayer. What you're watching, though nobody aboard would describe it in these terms, is a real and well-documented atmospheric phenomenon called St. Elmo's fire, a glowing electrical discharge that occurs when the air around a tall, pointed object becomes sufficiently charged during stormy conditions, the same basic physics behind lightning itself, just discharging continuously and quietly, rather than in a single violent bolt. Sailors across the Mediterranean and Atlantic world had been naming and interpreting it for centuries by this point, calling it after Saint Erasmus of Formia, known popularly as Elmo, an early Christian bishop venerated as a patron of sailors after his own reportedly calm demeanour during a storm at sea. Interpretations of what the glow actually meant varied considerably depending on which sailor you asked and which tradition he'd grown up in. Some considered it a good omen, a sign the worst of the storm had already passed, or that the saint himself was watching over the ship. Others treated its appearance with the same wary dread Corwin had shown his whistle, a visible reminder that the storm still had teeth. Your own crew splits roughly down the middle on the question, which somehow makes the flickering light more unsettling rather than less. Watching grown men who'd spent the whole afternoon confidently reefing sail now arguing in low voices about what a patch of glowing air actually portends. Duff the cook, of all people, turns out to have his own small ritual for nights like this, one you hadn't witnessed before tonight. Before the worst of any bad weather, he ladles out a slightly larger measure of rum than usual to every man who passes through his galley, along with a muttered phrase that sounds, as best you can make out over the wind, something like an old sailor's rhyme about calm seas and safe harbours, less a prayer exactly, than a kind of verbal habit worn smooth by repetition, the words mattering less than the simple ritual of saying them at all. Nobody questions it. Nobody thanks him for it particularly. Either it's just what Duff does. The way Abel checks a hook line twice on a night that worries him. The way half the crew touches a particular deck seam for luck before going below. A ship this size, crewed by men this frightened, this far from anything resembling solid ground, generates its own small liturgy out of pure repetition, whether anyone consciously designed it that way or not. There's a particular superstition about sailing days too, one you'd heard mentioned in passing weeks ago and only now fully understand the weight of. Friday, by a belief widespread enough across English and other European maritime traditions to have shaped actual sailing schedules for generations, was considered an unlucky day to begin a voyage, tied in most tellings to the association between Friday and the crucifixion, and reinforced by enough half-remembered stories of Friday departures ending badly that captains across multiple eras reportedly avoided setting sail on that particular day whenever their schedule allowed it. Whether your own captain holds to it strictly, you're honestly not sure. Ship's logs and merchant records from the period suggest the superstition was taken seriously by a meaningful portion of captains without being anything close to universal. The kind of belief a superstitious man honoured and a pragmatic one quietly ignored, depending mostly on his own temperament rather than any binding. Maritime law. By the time the worst of that grey, threatening night finally passes without ever quite delivering the storm everyone had braced for, Corwin Ashby has managed, mostly through Abel's quiet interventions and his own unremarkable competence, to avoid becoming anything worse than the subject of a few nervous mutters. It's a small, undramatic outcome, easy to overlook in a story otherwise full of shipwrecks and hurricanes, but it's exactly the kind of quiet, unrecorded mercy that never makes it into any ship's log or trial deposition, a crew choosing, in the end, not to need a scapegoat after all. The whistle he threw overboard is long gone, one small tin object added to however many centuries of superstitious offerings the sea has already swallowed without comment or consequence. You ask him, once the sky finally clears toward dawn, whether he regrets losing it. He shrugs. Didn't need it anyway, he says, which might be the most practical response anyone's given to the entire subject of shipboard superstition all week. Abel, overhearing, allows himself something close to a smile, the first you've seen from him in days. There's something worth sitting with in all of this, once the fear of the night has passed and you have a little room to actually think about it. None of these rituals, not the whistle tossed overboard, not the extra measure of rum, not the wary muttering at St. Elmo's fire flickering on the mast, actually changed the weather in any way a modern understanding of physics would recognise. The wind that night was going to do exactly what pressure systems and ocean currents determined it would do, regardless of whether Corwin kept his whistle or threw it away, regardless of whether Duff said his half-remembered rhyme over the rum ration or forgot it entirely. And yet it would be too easy, and probably too smug, to conclude that none of it mattered at all. A frightened crew facing genuine, repeated, life-or-death danger needed something to do with that fear beyond simply enduring it in silence, some sense, however illusory, of exercising a small measure of control over a force that was in every meaningful sense entirely beyond their control. No more subject to a tossed whistle or a cook's muttered rhyme than the tides themselves. The whistle thrown overboard didn't calm the wind. It calmed Corwin, at least a little, on a night when calm was in desperately short supply. Sometimes that's worth almost as much as the wind actually listening. Not every ship's crew, across the centuries this trade has existed, extended that same grace to the men they decided were bad luck. History and folklore both carry darker versions of tonight's story, cases where a crew's fear curdled into something considerably uglier than muttering near the forecastle, where a suspected Jonah found himself genuinely marooned, or worse, rather than simply watched a little more closely, cast off on some barren spit of sand with a pistol and a few days' water because a frightened crew needed. The story to end with someone paying for it. Your own crew, tonight at least, chose Abel's version of the story instead, quiet protection over open accusation, a captain's carpenter's steady example over a mob's need for someone to blame. It isn't a guarantee. Fear doesn't always resolve so gently, but it's what happened this time, on this ship, and it's worth noting when the better instinct wins. There's another superstition you learn about that same restless week, one considerably grimmer than a tossed whistle, and one that takes root the way these things always seem to, quietly, in the space of an afternoon, without anyone officially deciding it should. 2 days before the grey night that never quite broke into a full storm, a lookout spots a shark trailing the ship's wake, keeping pace with an unhurried patience that several of the older hands find more unsettling than any storm cloud, its dark shape visible just beneath the surface whenever the afternoon light hits the water right. Sharks following a vessel were widely regarded, across multiple maritime traditions of the period, as an omen of an impending death aboard. Whether because sharks genuinely did trail ships that regularly dumped refuse, and occasionally bodies overboard, giving the superstition an uncomfortable basis in observed reality, or simply because a large predator patiently shadowing your home for days running is the kind of thing that unsettles even a rational mind. You watch more than one hardened sailor spit over the rail at the sight of the dorsal fin cutting through the wake, a small defensive gesture against a danger nobody could actually explain how spitting might prevent. Not every animal aboard carries the same dread though, and the contrast is worth noting. The ship keeps at least 2 cats below decks, working mousers whose entire job is controlling the rats and mice that would otherwise ravage the biscuit stores and gnaw through rope and canvas alike, and far from being considered unlucky. A ship's cat was widely regarded as a positive good luck charm across English maritime tradition, a striking inversion of the black cat superstition common ashore, where the exact same animal, in the exact same colour, carried the opposite reputation entirely, depending on whether you were standing on a dock or a deck. Sailors reportedly went to considerable lengths to keep a ship's cat happy, and, if she went missing overboard, to retrieve her if at all possible, treating her well-being as something close to the ship's own fortune. You've seen more than one hardened crew member slip the ship's senior cat a scrap of salt pork with a tenderness he'd never show openly toward another human being aboard. There's an older ritual buried in the ship's own construction, one Davy Prosser tells you about almost offhand while working a repair near the base of the mainmast, still favouring his bandaged hand, weeks after the storm that injured it. When a mast is originally stepped into a ship during construction, set into its socket at the keel, the foundational moment of building the entire rig above it, shipbuilders across an extraordinarily long tradition, reaching back at least to Roman times and continuing well into the age of sail, commonly placed a single coin beneath it first. A small offering meant to buy the ship luck, and according to some tellings, ensure the crew always had at least a coin's worth of fortune to their name, no matter how badly a voyage went otherwise. Davy doesn't know which coin sits under this particular ship's mainmast, since she was built as an honest merchant vessel years before this crew ever captured her, but he's confident one is down there somewhere. Every ship's got one, he says. Wouldn't trust a mast that didn't. Perhaps strangest of all, given the sheer number of ships changing hands throughout the Golden Age of Piracy, is how thoroughly pirate crews seem to have simply ignored one of the more deeply rooted maritime superstitions of the era, that renaming a ship invites catastrophic bad luck, unwritten but seriously respected law holding that a vessel's original name, given at her launch, was somehow bound up with her fate, and that changing it courted disaster. By strict practical necessity, pirate crews broke this rule constantly. A captured merchant vessel refit for piracy was, more often than not, renamed almost immediately, partly for practical reasons of disguise, and partly, one suspects, because a crew that had just taken a ship by force wasn't always inclined to keep sailing under a name chosen by the merchant owners they'd just relieved of her. Bellamy's own wider galley kept her original name even after capture, which was actually somewhat unusual. Plenty of other prizes throughout this era sailed on under entirely new identities within days of changing hands, superstition or no superstition, because a trade built on repeatedly stealing other people's ships was never going to have much patience for a rule that inconvenient. There's a phrase you hear more than once that week, usually muttered by an older hand in reference to some sailor lost overboard years before your time aboard, or in dark joking reference to whatever the sea might do to all of you before this voyage is through, gone to Davy Jones's locker. Nobody aboard can tell you with any confidence where the phrase actually comes from, and honestly, neither can anyone else. The origin of Davy Jones as shorthand for the spirit or devil of the deep sea, and his locker as a euphemism for a watery grave, is genuinely uncertain even by modern scholarly standards, with competing theories ranging from a corruption of the biblical Jonah's name to a garbled reference to a real or entirely fictional London pub owner, none of them backed by evidence solid enough to settle the question. What matters more than the etymology, sitting there listening to it invoked yet again over a game of dice below decks, is how completely ordinary the phrase has become, a term flexible enough to cover everything from a genuine death at sea to a lost hat blown over the rail, deployed with the same dark. Practiced humour sailors of every era have used to talk about the thing that might kill them without actually having to say it plainly. It's the same instinct, in a gentler register, that sent Corwin's whistle over the side and had half the crew muttering at St. Elmo's glow on the mast, a whole vocabulary built, one phrase and one ritual at a time, out of the plane. Stubborn need to say something about fear, rather than simply carrying it in silence. Somewhere out past the horizon, in waters considerably north of where your own ship sails tonight, the wreck of a very different vessel has been sitting on the ocean floor for years already. Its own crew's fears and rituals and last desperate prayers long since gone silent under the sand. Nobody aboard your ship knows it yet, but the story of that wreck, the wider, the ship whose sinking you already heard about earlier tonight, is far from finished. It's about to be found again, 2.5 centuries later, by people who were never remotely sailors at all. On July 20th, 1984, a diver working roughly 15 feet down in murky, current-churned water off the outer coast of Cape Cod surfaced holding something that would settle, in a single afternoon, a question that had stood open for 267 years, a ship's bell, corroded and encrusted with 2.5 centuries of marine growth. But with lettering still faintly legible once the team worked away enough of the accumulated crust to read it. The wider galley. 1716. It was the first time in recorded history that a pirate shipwreck had been positively identified anywhere in the world through physical evidence rather than legend, rumour, or a treasure hunter's optimistic guess. Every survivor's deposition, every scattered colonial record, every fragment of the story you already heard earlier tonight, suddenly had a physical anchor sitting on a table on a research vessel, dripping salt water, spelling out its own name to confirm what 2.5 centuries of local legend had never quite been able to prove on its own. This is the story of how a ship lost for nearly 3 centuries finally got found again, and what finding her actually told historians about the men who died aboard her. A story considerably richer and stranger than anyone standing on that research vessel deck in 1984 had any reason to expect. The man who found her, Barry Clifford, wasn't a professional marine archaeologist by training, and it's worth understanding what actually drove him to spend years and a considerable fortune searching for a ship most serious historians assumed, if they thought about it at all, was either long since disintegrated beyond recognition, or scattered too widely across the seafloor to ever be properly identified. The kind of quixotic, expensive obsession that, had it failed, would likely have earned him nothing more than a footnote as one more treasure hunter chasing a story that never panned out. Clifford had grown up on Cape Cod hearing local legends about the Wider from an uncle. Folklore passed down through generations of Cape families who'd lived their whole lives within sight of the outer beach where the disaster happened. Stories that treated the wreck less as verified history than as the kind of half-believed local colour every old coastal town accumulates about its own past. What set Clifford apart from generations of earlier Cape Cod residents who'd grown up on the same stories was a stubborn, expensive decision, made as an adult, to actually go looking for the thing the legends kept describing. He founded a company, Maritime Explorations Incorporated, and began serious archival research well before ever putting a diver in the water, tracking down colonial-era documents including the deposition testimony given by Thomas Davis after his rescue, the same testimony that anchors so much of what we know about the night the ship actually went down, along with contemporary published accounts like the one Boston minister Cotton Mather produced within weeks of the disaster. A document mixing genuine reporting on the wreck with the kind of moralizing religious reflection typical of Mather's other writing, but nonetheless containing real, useful geographic and circumstantial detail about where and how the ship had gone down. Piecing together colonial correspondence, survivor testimony, and later salvage records describing what had and hadn't been recovered by Spanish and English salvagers working the beach in the weeks after the wreck, Clifford's team narrowed their search to a specific stretch of shallow water off what's now Marconi Beach in Wellfleet, named in one of history's stranger coincidences, for the same Guglielmo Marconi whose early radio experiments took place on that same stretch of coastline nearly 2 centuries after Bellamy's ship went down there. The actual search took roughly 2 years of methodical, often frustrating work, beginning in 1982 and continuing until that July afternoon in 1984, towing magnetometers across the search grid to detect concentrations of iron and other metal beneath the shifting sand, following up promising readings with divers working in water that, by all accounts, offered miserable visibility even on a calm day, churned constantly by the same currents and storm patterns that had destroyed the ship in the first place. It's a strange, almost circular kind of irony. The very conditions that made this stretch of coastline so dangerous to Bellamy's crew in 1717 were the same conditions making it so difficult, 260-odd years later, for anyone to find what those conditions had left behind. The Bell's discovery didn't just end a search. It effectively created an entirely new category of verified historical evidence, because everything Clifford's team recovered from the site over the following years and decades could now be confidently attributed to a specific, documented, dated pirate crew, rather than treated as generic period artifacts of uncertain origin. Coins came up by the thousands, pieces of 8 from Spanish mints across the Americas, gold coins, smaller denominations, a physical confirmation of just how much plundered wealth the Wider had been carrying when the storm caught her, exactly the kind of treasure that had drawn salvagers scrambling along this same beach within days of the original wreck in 1717. Cannon came up too, along with the ship's rigging fittings, navigational instruments, and a staggering quantity of small personal items, buttons, buckles, tools, clay pipes, the kind of ordinary, unglamorous belongings that turn an abstract death toll back into a collection of individual people who had, until one specific April night, been going about entirely ordinary lives aboard an entirely functioning ship. Divers also recovered fragments of the ship's own rigging hardware, blocks and deadeyes not unlike the very block that struck Davy Prosser's hand during your own storm, a small, strange reminder that the equipment aboard your ship and the equipment aboard the wider were, in most practical respects, functionally identical. One artifact in particular does more to humanize this story than almost anything else recovered from the site, and it's worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. The way it's tempting to do with any single detail buried inside a death toll this large. Among the personal effects recovered was a small leather shoe still containing, preserved by centuries of cold sand and low oxygen, a fragment of leg bone. Archaeological analysis suggested the shoe belonged to someone quite young, likely a boy in his early teens, almost certainly one of the ship's powder monkeys, doing exactly the job you watched a boy named Isaiah do on your own ship earlier tonight, running charges and messages through chaos. Small enough to move fast through spaces adult men couldn't manage. There's no way to know his name. There's no surviving record that could tell you anything about who he was before that April night, what town he came from, whether he'd chosen piracy or been forced into it the way Thomas Davis had, whether he had a mother somewhere on the Cape or across the Atlantic, who spent years afterward not knowing what had become of her son. All that's left of him, after 267 years underwater, is a single small shoe and the fragment of bone inside it. Mute, specific, considerably more affecting than any death toll printed as a round number ever could be. The recovery effort didn't proceed without conflict, and it's worth being honest about that too, rather than presenting the whole story as a tidy triumph of dedicated research. Clifford's team found themselves over the following years in a genuinely complicated legal fight with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts over ownership and salvage rights to the wreck and its contents. A dispute eventually resolved through federal admiralty law in Clifford's favour, establishing his company's rights to continue excavating and, within certain regulatory limits, to sell some portion of what was recovered, while requiring that historically and archaeologically significant material be preserved and made available for scholarly study and public display, rather than simply auctioned. Off piece by piece to private collectors. It's the kind of unglamorous legal wrangling that rarely makes it into the more romantic tellings of shipwreck discovery stories, but it mattered enormously to what actually happened to the wider's story afterward. The difference between a wreck's contents scattering into private hands within a decade of discovery, and a wreck's contents anchoring a genuine museum collection that decades later ordinary visitors can still walk through and see for themselves. That museum exists today on Cape Cod, built specifically around the wider's recovered artefacts, and it has become, over the decades since 1984, something considerably more valuable to historians than simply a repository of pirate treasure. Because every object in that collection can be dated with confidence to a single ship, on a single voyage, at a single moment. It has let historians and archaeologists test and refine a great deal of what was previously known about Golden Age piracy only through second-hand accounts, court records, and Charles Johnson's famously unreliable general history. The wider's recovered cannon confirmed details about her armament that only partially matched contemporary written descriptions. Her coins provide hard physical evidence for exactly what kind of plunder a successful pirate voyage in 1717 actually carried. An analysis of the crew's personal effects, the sheer range of tools, buttons, and everyday objects representing dramatically different national and cultural origins, all mixed together in the same wreck debris, has reinforced something historians had already suspected from scattered documentary evidence, but could now demonstrate with physical proof, that Bellamy's crew, like a great many pirate crews of this era, was remarkably diverse by the standards of virtually any other maritime institution then operating in the Atlantic world. Modern research into the wider's crew composition cross-referencing surviving trial records with the archaeological findings, suggests that a meaningful portion of the men aboard, estimates offered by researchers who've studied the site, run to roughly a quarter or more of the crew were of African descent, some of them formerly enslaved men who had escaped or been freed and had subsequently signed the ship's articles as full crew members, entitled under those same articles to an equal-ish share of plunder and an equal vote in the crew's decisions, a status available to them nowhere else in the entire Atlantic maritime world of 1717. It's a detail easy to state briefly and hard to actually absorb: men who had been treated as property under colonial law, in some cases quite possibly transported across the Atlantic aboard a ship very much like the Wider herself before her capture, found aboard a pirate vessel, something no merchant ship, no naval vessel, no plantation in any English or Spanish colony was prepared to offer them, a genuine, documented, voted upon share in their own fate. It's worth returning, one final time, to the ship's articles you read earlier in this story, back in the calm weeks before your own storm, the promise of compensation for a lost limb, the vote for captain, the shared risk and shared reward extended to every man who signed regardless of where he'd been born or what colour his skin was. Aboard almost any other vessel of this era, whether merchant, naval or otherwise, that promise simply didn't exist for a black sailor, free or otherwise. Aboard the Wider, however imperfectly and however briefly, for however self-interested a set of reasons a desperate pirate captain might have had for extending it, it apparently did. The excavation itself, once it began in earnest, turned out to be nothing like the quick, dramatic treasure-hunting montage popular imagination tends to attach to shipwreck discoveries. Recovering an object from the seafloor is, in a very real sense, only the first and least difficult step. Conservation of anything pulled from centuries of salt water is a slow, chemically delicate process that can take months or even years per object, particularly for iron artifacts like cannon and rigging fittings, which arrive from the seabed saturated with salt but will, if left untreated, cause the metal to crumble apart within weeks of exposure to open air. Conservators worked, and continue working, decades later, since portions of the site remain under active archaeological study even now, through painstaking desalination baths, careful mechanical removal of marine concretion, and specialized treatments designed to stabilize each object well enough that it can survive display in a climate-controlled museum case, rather than simply disintegrating the moment it dries out completely. Work slow enough and unglamorous enough that it rarely makes it into any popular account of the discovery at all. A cannon that spent 2.5 centuries settling into the sand off Wellfleet might spend the better part of a decade in a conservation lab before it's considered stable enough to safely display to the public at all. It is, in other words, a discovery still actively unfolding, artifact by artifact, generations after that first bell broke the surface in 1984. National Geographic and various academic partners took an interest in the project as its significance became clearer through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, funding additional survey seasons and lending the kind of institutional credibility that helped settle lingering skepticism among some professional archaeologists who had initially treated Clifford's claims with considerable caution. Treasure hunters, after all, have a long and not entirely flattering history of overselling modest finds, and it took years of careful, verifiable, peer-reviewed work before the broader archaeological community fully accepted the Wider site for what it plainly was, the single best documented pirate shipwreck ever recovered anywhere in the world. A genuine time capsule from a single specific night, rather than a scattered, ambiguous collection of period-adjacent debris. That skepticism, in hindsight, wasn't unreasonable caution misapplied. It was exactly the kind of scrutiny a field still stinging from decades of dubious treasure hunting claims needed to apply before accepting any single find as the real thing. And the Wider earned its acceptance the slow way, one verified, dated, cross-referenced artifact at a time. The Wider's confirmed identification also did something less tangible but arguably just as important. It proved, for the first time with hard physical evidence, that a pirate wreck from this specific era could actually be found, identified, and excavated using rigorous methods. And that proof changed how researchers approached the search for other lost pirate vessels across the following decades. Blackbeard's own flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, run aground off the coast of North Carolina in 1718 after a considerably less violent end than the Wider's, wasn't located and confirmed until 1996, 12 years after Clifford's team found the Wider's bell. A search that drew directly on techniques and archival methods first proven out on the Cape Cod site. Other searches followed the same template in the decades since. Treasure hunters and academic archaeologists alike learning to combine deposition testimony, colonial correspondence, and careful magnetometer survey work, rather than simply dragging the seafloor and hoping. It's a strange kind of legacy for a shipwreck to have, but a fitting one. Not just the physical recovery of one crew's story, but the opening of a door that let historians go looking, with real confidence for the first time, for all the others. There's something worth returning to, one last time, about Abel Rourke and Davy Prosser and Isaiah Fenn and every other man you've spent tonight's story alongside, none of whom obviously sailed aboard the Wider herself, and none of whom this particular retelling has any way of confirming survived their own voyage all the way to old age. That's simply the honest limit of a story built, as this one has been, around an invented crew standing in for thousands of real ones, whose individual names mostly never made it into any surviving record at all. What the Wider's recovered artefacts do, better than almost any other single archaeological find from this entire era, is confirm that men exactly like them existed in exactly the numbers and exactly the circumstances this story has described. Carpenters with crushed fingers, powder monkeys barely into their teens, sailmakers who'd lost fingers of their own to a marlin spike years before, all of them sleeping in identical rope and canvas hammocks, all of them subject to the identical mathematics of storm and current and probability that put 144 of the Wider's own crew on the seafloor in a single April night. The shoe with the bone still inside it isn't Isaiah's shoe. But it could have been. That's precisely the point. This is the story of the Wider Galley, the ship whose sinking taught 18th century Boston a hard lesson about storms and mercy, and whose rediscovery, 267 years later, taught modern historians an equally hard lesson about how much of the human detail in a story like this gets lost the moment the last eyewitness dies, and how much of it, remarkably, can sometimes be recovered anyway. One corroded bell and one small leather shoe at a time. Thomas Davis, the Welsh carpenter who survived that April night and successfully argued his way out of the gallows by proving he'd been forced aboard against his will, doesn't appear again in any historical record after his 1717 acquittal. No death record, no later mention, nothing beyond the bare fact of his survival and his freedom. A life that simply resumes somewhere just outside the edge of what any surviving document happened to capture. Whether he went home to Wales, stayed in the American colonies, or returned to some entirely ordinary maritime life history simply never bothered to document, nobody now can say. It's a strange kind of ending for a man who survived one of the deadliest single nights in the entire history of Atlantic piracy. Not a dramatic death, not a documented triumph, just a quiet dropping out of the written record. The fate of most ordinary people, who briefly touch a famous historical event and then simply go on living the rest of their lives outside history's notice. John Julian's fate remains, as it was when this story first mentioned him. Frustratingly uncertain, fragmentary colonial records suggesting he may have been sold into slavery rather than tried, and nothing more definitive that modern research has been able to add with confidence. A silence in the record that feels, if anything, even more pointed now that so much else about this ship has finally been recovered. 267 years is a genuinely difficult span of time to hold in your head all at once, so it's worth trying for a moment to actually picture it. It is longer than the entire history of the United States as an independent nation. It is longer than the gap between Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage and Samuel Bellamy's capture of the Wider in 1717, which means the wreck sat undisturbed on the seafloor for a span of time longer than separated the very hammock you learned to sling earlier tonight from the Tanno beach where it was first invented. For nearly 3 centuries, that bell sat in cold, dark, current-churned water 15 feet below the surface, 15 feet and 267 years away from anyone reading its inscription again, while entire empires rose and fell on land not far away, while the very superstitions and rituals you heard about earlier tonight slowly faded from common practice, while the hammock itself, still swinging aboard ships around the world, quietly kept doing exactly the job it had always done. And then, on one particular July afternoon in 1984, a diver's hand closed around it, and the silence broke. Somewhere back at the very start of tonight, before any of this, before Abel Rourke ever tossed you a rolled length of canvas and told you to sling it loose and low, before Davy Prosser ever put his crushed hand back to work by voice alone, before a boy named Isaiah finally went slack in his hammock and slept through the worst of it, you were told about a piece of rope and canvas engineering worth 4 shillings, and about 144 men who never got the chance to test it on the one night it would have mattered least. That's the whole of it, really. Not a story about pirates being fearless. A story about a very old, very simple idea borrowed from a people history nearly erased, carried across an ocean. Slept in by kings, sailors and outlaws alike, doing exactly what it was built to do, for as long as the ship around it held together, and being powerless to do anything at all once it didn't. You made it through your storm. Abel's not held. Davy's seam held. Isaiah is still breathing a few feet away from you, and so, somewhere out past the edge of this story, is the small tin whistle Corwin never really needed in the first place. 267 years from now, someone will still be finding pieces of a ship very much like yours, scattered across a sandbar off a coast none of you have ever seen, and calling it history rather than a Tuesday. You're warm right now. You're dry.
Nothing under you is swinging, and nothing outside is trying to take the roof off your world tonight. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.